My name is Lauren, 33 years old, and I came home from a combat zone in a wheelchair. Before I could even learn to walk again, my husband emptied our bank accounts, filed for divorce, and walked away with his assistant, leaving me entirely alone with our 5-month-old son. 4 years later, he ambushed me with a lawsuit for full custody, banking on my injuries to paint me as an unfit mother. But when the federal judge read just one sentence from my classified military file, my ex-husband went dead pale and realized he had brought a knife to a gunfight. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The afternoon sun was beating down on the concrete courtyard of my son Leo's kindergarten. It was exactly 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, which also happened to be my 33rd birthday. I was holding Leo by his small hand, listening to him chatter excitedly about a painting he had made in class. The day felt perfectly ordinary, the kind of quiet, stable routine I had fought so hard to build after the explosion that nearly took my life overseas. Other parents were milling around the pickup area, chatting in small groups and loading their children into SUVs. I had just shifted my weight to ease the slight ache in my right leg when a shadow fell across our path. I looked up and my heart slammed against my ribs. Standing directly in front of us, blocking our way to the parking lot, was my ex-husband Jason. Beside him stood his new wife Brittany. They were not alone. A man in a cheap gray suit stepped out from behind Jason and shoved a thick manila envelope directly against my chest. Instinctively, I caught the heavy package before it could hit Leo. The man muttered a quick confirmation of my name and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of confused parents. I stared at the envelope, the legal seals glaring back at me, before looking up at Jason. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, looking every bit the wealthy financial executive he always desperately wanted to be. His face was twisted into a smug, triumphant smile. Without lowering his voice, without any regard for our 5-year-old son standing right there, Jason announced to the entire courtyard that he was suing for full, immediate, and emergency custody of Leo. The courtyard went completely silent. Every parent, every teacher, every child stopped what they were doing to stare at us. Jason projected his voice purposefully, ensuring that his words carried across the playground. He declared that it was time for Leo to live in a proper home with proper parents, rather than staying in a cramped house with a broken woman. My grip on Leo's hand tightened. My breathing grew shallow, and a roaring sound filled my ears. This was an ambush meticulously planned and executed in the most public, humiliating way possible to catch me off guard. Leo shrank behind my leg, frightened by the sudden tension and the loud voice of a father he barely knew. Jason stood there, puffing out his chest, reveling in the spectacle he had created. He wanted me to break down. He wanted me to cry, to scream, to show the other parents that I was exactly the unstable wreck he was claiming I was. But my military training kicked in, pushing the panic down and locking it away. Then Brittany stepped forward. She was 26, dressed in designer clothes that cost more than my first car, radiating cheap perfume. She pulled out her phone, held it up high, and pointed the camera directly at my face. The red recording light blinked steadily. She smoothed her hair and put on a sickeningly sweet, exaggerated voice, clearly performing for her social media followers. She spoke directly to the camera, saying that being a stepmom meant making the hard choices, and that today she and Jason were rescuing their little boy from a toxic and unsafe environment. She actually used the word rescuing. She narrated the scene as if I were a monster keeping Leo captive, describing how they were finally stepping up to give him the luxurious life he deserved. She then panned the camera down to my legs, zooming in on the slight limp I still carried from my combat injuries. Brittany told her viewers that it was tragic what happened to me overseas, but a growing boy needed a mother who could actually run across a playground with him, not someone who struggled to walk up a flight of stairs. Jason eagerly chimed in, stepping into the frame of the video. He loudly proclaimed that I was a crippled, broke veteran living on government handouts. He told the surrounding crowd of parents that it was child abuse to let a boy be raised by an unstable woman who relied on disability checks. He weaponized the very sacrifices I had made for my country, twisting my injuries into a narrative of incompetence. The cruelty was breathtaking. They were using the darkest, most painful chapter of my life as content for their own vanity and legal ammunition. I could feel the stares of the other mothers burning into my skin. Some looked horrified, others looked pitying, and a few were whispering behind their hands. The sheer audacity of their performance was designed to suffocate me with shame. Brittany kept the phone inches from my face, demanding that I speak to her followers, demanding that I admit I was failing as a mother. She pushed the lens closer, waiting for the tears, waiting for me to shatter, so she could post my destruction online for millions to see. But I did not give them a single tear. I did not raise my voice, and I did not flinch. I let go of Leo's hand just long enough to push Brittany's phone away with a forceful, definitive strike. She stumbled backward, gasping in feigned shock as the phone nearly dropped from her manicured hands. I took a step closer to Jason, closing the distance until I was looking dead into his arrogant eyes. The entire courtyard was hanging on my every word, and I made sure my voice was loud, clear, and perfectly steady. I told Jason that he was putting on a fascinating show for a man who emptied our joint bank accounts while I was lying unconscious in a military hospital bed. I watched the color drain from his cheeks as the crowd gasped. I did not stop. I told the surrounding parents exactly who was standing before them. I explained that 4 years ago, when I was blown up in a convoy and fighting to keep my legs, this wealthy executive filed for divorce over email. I announced that he abandoned his 5-month-old baby, left us with absolutely nothing, and ran off with his 22-year-old assistant who was currently holding the camera. The whispering in this courtyard abruptly stopped. The pitying looks the other parents had been giving me instantly transformed into glaring, disgusted stares directed entirely at Jason and Brittany. Brittany lowered her phone, her face turning crimson as the surrounding mothers began to murmur in outrage. Jason opened his mouth to defend himself, his smug facade cracking into visible panic as he realized his public ambush had just backfired spectacularly. He sputtered, trying to call me a liar, but the damage was already done. The truth has a certain weight to it, and everyone in that courtyard could feel it. I did not wait for his rebuttal. I turned my back on them both, scooped Leo up into my arms despite the burning ache in my leg, and walked straight to my car. My posture was rigid, my head held high, refusing to show a single ounce of weakness. I secured Leo in his car seat, reassuring him with a soft smile that everything was completely fine. As I closed his door and walked around to the driver's side, Jason shouted across the parking lot that I would be hearing from his lawyers, promising to take everything I had left. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. The battle lines were officially drawn, and as the adrenaline slowly faded into cold determination, I knew I was going to war. Brittany stepped forward, the sharp clack of her designer heels echoing against the concrete courtyard. The heavy manila envelope containing the custody lawsuit was still burning a hole against my chest, but before I could even process the legal assault, the psychological warfare began. Brittany closed the distance between us, her overwhelming floral perfume suffocating the warm afternoon air. She was 26, wrapped in a pristine white silk blazer, and carrying a handbag that cost more than my mortgage. She reached into that bag and pulled out her latest model smartphone, holding it up like a weapon. The bright screen illuminated her perfectly contoured face as she tapped the screen, the red recording light blinking to life. Without a shred of hesitation, she shoved the camera lens mere inches from my face. She did not ask for permission. She did not care that we were standing in the middle of a crowded kindergarten pickup zone. She smoothed her glossy blonde hair with her free hand, angled the phone to capture both of our faces, and put on a sickeningly sweet, exaggerated voice. She was live broadcasting this ambush to her thousands of social media followers. "Hey guys," Brittany chirped, her voice dripping with venomous fake sympathy. "I know I usually post about interior design and lifestyle, but today is a really emotional day for our family. Jason and I are currently at Leo's school. Being a stepmom means making the hard choices, and today we are finally taking action to rescue our little boy from a highly toxic, unsafe environment." She actually used the word rescue. My blood turned to ice. I tightened my grip on Leo's hand, pulling his small body slightly behind my good leg to shield him from the camera. Leo was trembling, his wide eyes darting between the glaring phone lens and his father's arrogant face. Brittany noticed my defensive movement and immediately panned the camera down, intentionally capturing my faded denim jeans, my worn-out tactical boots, and the simple gray t-shirt I had thrown on that morning. She let out a soft, mocking sigh for her audience. "As you can see," she narrated, "some people just let themselves go completely. It is honestly tragic. Little Leo deserves a mother who cares about presenting a stable, healthy image, not someone who looks like they just crawled out of a survival shelter." The sheer audacity of her performance was staggering. She was live streaming my humiliation, trying to provoke a reaction. I kept my face entirely blank, relying on years of military intelligence training to lock my emotions in a steel vault. In a combat zone, you never let the enemy see you bleed. But Brittany was not finished. She took a step to the side, forcing me to pivot to keep my body between her and Leo. The sudden movement sent a sharp shooting pain up my right leg. I winced, a tiny involuntary reflex, and my weight shifted awkwardly onto my left side to compensate for the permanent nerve damage. Brittany caught the movement on camera. Her eyes lit up with malicious glee. She zoomed in on my legs, ensuring her followers could clearly see my uneven stance and the slight stiffness in my knee. "It is just so sad what happened to her overseas," Brittany cooed to her digital audience, her tone dripping with condescension. But let us be completely honest here. A growing, energetic 5-year-old boy needs a mother who can actually run across a playground with him. He needs someone who is active, vibrant, and whole, not someone who struggles to walk up a single flight of stairs without gasping for breath. A child should not be burdened with caring for a disabled parent. Before I could tell her to get the phone out of my face, Jason stepped into the camera's frame. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his expensive tie, eager to play the heroic father figure for the internet. He raised his voice not just for the camera, but projecting his words so that every single parent, teacher, and child in the courtyard could hear him loud and clear. "We are doing what is necessary," Jason announced, his voice echoing off the brick walls of the school building. "This is not about being cruel. This is about protecting my son from a crippled, broke veteran who is perfectly content living on government handouts." The courtyard went dead silent. The casual chatter of parents halted instantly. I could feel dozens of eyes burning into my skin. The word crippled hung in the air, a vile, jagged insult designed to strip away my dignity. Jason took another step toward me, towering over my slight frame. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, his face contorted with self-righteous anger. "You have no business raising a child, Lauren. Look at you. You rely on disability checks. You live in a tiny, cramped house. You are physically broken. It is absolute child abuse to force my son to live with an unstable woman who cannot even provide basic physical security." The whispers began rippling through the crowd of bystanders. Other mothers pulled their children closer, staring at us with a mixture of horror, pity, and morbid curiosity. The humiliation was designed to break my spirit right then and there. Jason wanted me to snap. He wanted me to scream, to lash out, to act exactly like the unhinged, dangerous veteran he was claiming I was. If I raised my voice or slapped the phone out of Brittany's hand, they would have it on video. They would show it to a family court judge as proof of my violent tendencies. It was a perfectly executed psychological trap. "A child needs stability," Jason continued, his voice dripping with arrogance as he played to the surrounding crowd. "He needs a proper home. He needs a father who can provide a future, not a mother who wakes up screaming from night terrors. You are damaged goods, Lauren. You brought your trauma back from the war, and you are infecting my son with it every single day." He was weaponizing the very sacrifices I had made for our country. He was using the scars I earned surviving an explosive device to paint me as a liability. The physical pain in my leg was nothing compared to the white-hot rage building in my chest. I remembered the grueling months of physical therapy, the agonizing hours spent learning to walk again just so I could carry my son in my arms. Jason had not been there for a single second of that recovery. He had abandoned us. And now he stood here, using my hard-won survival as a weapon to tear my child away from me. Brittany pushed the camera closer, the lens almost touching my nose. "Say goodbye to him, Lauren," she taunted with a vicious smirk. "The emergency hearing is on Friday. By this weekend, Leo will finally be in a safe, healthy environment. You can go back to your miserable, broken life." I stood rooted to the concrete, the heavy manila envelope still pressed against my chest. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained a mask of absolute chilling calm. The trap was set, the audience was watching, and Jason thought he had already won. He thought he had completely disarmed me. He had absolutely no idea what I was about to do next. I did not shrink away from the glaring light of Brittany's phone screen. I did not drop my gaze, and I absolutely did not give them the hysterical reaction they were begging for. Instead, I tightened my grip on the manila envelope, stood as tall as my injured leg would allow, and looked past the camera directly into Jason's eyes. Then I turned my attention to the crowd of parents who had formed a tight circle around us. If Jason wanted an audience, I was going to give him one. I projected my voice, making sure it carried across the concrete courtyard, cutting through the heavy silence with absolute surgical precision. "You put on a fascinating show, Jason," I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady. "It takes a very special kind of man to stand in a schoolyard and scream about family values, especially a man who emptied our joint bank accounts while his wife was lying unconscious in a military hospital bed." I watched the smug satisfaction drain instantly from Jason's face. The color vanished from his cheeks, replaced by a sickly pale hue. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The surrounding parents gasped, exchanging shocked glances. I did not stop. I stepped forward, forcing Brittany to lower her phone slightly as she backed away. "Tell them the rest of the story," I demanded, keeping my volume loud enough for every single teacher and parent to hear. "Tell these good people how 4 years ago my military convoy was hit by an explosive device overseas. Tell them how I spent months fighting multiple infections just to keep my right leg. And while I was undergoing my 3rd reconstructive surgery, learning how to walk again so I could come home and hold our son, you did not fly to my bedside. You stayed right here in a comfortable office, drained every single penny we had saved, and served me with divorce papers via an email." The courtyard erupted into furious murmurs. Other mothers who moments ago had looked at me with pity or suspicion now glared at Jason with undisguised disgust. Brittany's hand began to shake, the phone trembling, as her live stream captured a reality she had never intended to broadcast. "And let us not forget the best part," I continued, my voice sharp as broken glass. I turned my icy stare toward Brittany. "Tell your internet followers how you fit into this timeline, Brittany. Tell them how Jason abandoned his 5-month-old baby boy. He left a helpless infant crying in a crib so he could run off to a luxury hotel with his 22-year-old assistant. You are not rescuing my son from anything. You are the woman who helped his father abandon him." Brittany's mouth fell open in horror. She fumbled with her phone, her manicured thumb frantically tapping the screen to end the live broadcast. She realized too late that hundreds of strangers had just watched her fairy tale narrative get completely annihilated. The pristine, heroic stepmom image she had carefully curated online was destroyed in less than 60 seconds. "You are lying," Jason sputtered, his voice cracking as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "You are making this up because you are crazy. Everyone can see how unstable you are." "Bank routing numbers and court filing dates do not lie, Jason," I replied smoothly. "You filed for divorce on October 14th. I was still in the intensive care unit. You wired our savings to an offshore account on October 12th. You moved into a downtown penthouse with your assistant on October 20th. Those are public records. Anyone with an internet connection can look them up." A father standing nearby crossed his arms and loudly called Jason a coward. Another mother pulled her daughter away, shooting Brittany a look of pure contempt. The very audience Jason had tried to weaponize against me had turned into an angry mob, and they were firmly on my side. The social isolation he had planned for me was now crashing down on his own head. Brittany scrambled backward, hiding her phone in her expensive handbag, her face flushed crimson with humiliation. She grabbed Jason's arm, tugging at his custom-tailored suit jacket. She frantically whispered that they needed to leave right now before people started filming them. Jason shook her off his ego, refusing to accept defeat. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his chest heaving with rage. "You think you are so smart?" he snarled, dropping the concerned father act entirely. "You think playing the wounded veteran card will save you in court? It will not. I have the best corporate lawyers in the state. They will tear you apart. You will never see Leo again." I looked down at Leo. My brave, quiet boy was staring up at me, his small hand clutching my jeans. I gave him a reassuring smile, projecting complete safety and warmth. I bent down slightly, ignoring the flare of pain in my knee, and effortlessly lifted my 50-pound son into my arms. I balanced him on my left hip, proving to everyone watching that I was more than capable of physically supporting my child. I turned my attention back to Jason for one final moment. I raised my free hand and forcefully swatted his pointing finger out of my personal space. The physical contact was abrupt and definitive. He flinched, taking a defensive step backward. "I survived a roadside bomb," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Do you really think a coward in a cheap suit scares me?" Without waiting for his response, I turned my back on them. I walked through the parted crowd of parents who silently stepped aside to clear a path for me. I held my head high, my posture rigid and commanding. The slight stiffness in my gait was no longer a symbol of weakness. It was proof of my resilience. I reached my car, opened the rear door, and carefully buckled Leo into his car seat. I kissed his forehead, promising him that we were going to get ice cream on the way home. I closed his door, walked around to the driver's side, and slid into the seat. Through the windshield, I could see Jason pacing furiously in the courtyard, screaming into his cell phone, while Brittany hid her face behind her oversized sunglasses. I started the engine, shifted into gear, and drove out of the school parking lot. The manila envelope rested heavily on the passenger seat, a grim reminder of the legal war that was just beginning. Jason had fired the first shot, hoping for a quick surrender, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with a broken victim. He had no idea he had just declared war on a soldier who knew exactly how to fight back. The drive home was quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft sounds of Leo enjoying his vanilla ice cream in the back seat. I pulled into the driveway of our modest two-bedroom house, shut off the engine, and let my forehead rest against the steering wheel for just a fraction of a second. The adrenaline that had carried me through the courtyard confrontation was rapidly burning off, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in my bones. My right leg throbbed, a sharp reminder of the physical toll stress always took on my injured nerves. But I could not afford the luxury of collapsing. I helped Leo inside, got him settled in the living room with his favorite cartoon, and walked straight to my kitchen table. The manila envelope landed on the wood surface with a heavy thud. I did not even need to read the endless pages of legal jargon inside. I knew exactly how Jason operated. He relied on shock and awe. He wanted to overwhelm me with paperwork and expensive lawyers until I simply gave up. I was not going to give up, but I needed to secure my own legal representation immediately. I opened my laptop and pulled up the contact information for a highly recommended family law attorney I had consulted months ago for a different matter. I knew her retainer fee was steep, requiring an immediate wire transfer of $10,000 just to officially take the case. It was a massive hit to my finances, but I had prepared for rainy days. I had my military disability back, pay my carefully managed savings, and the modest child support Jason was legally forced to pay, though he constantly complained about it. I clicked open a new tab, navigated to my primary banking portal, and typed in my credentials. I reached for my coffee mug, taking a sip as the dashboard loaded. The screen refreshed. I blinked, lowering my mug slowly to the table. The numbers staring back at me did not make sense. Available balance $0. Checking account restricted. Savings account frozen. A bright red banner flashed across the top of my screen, instructing me to contact the Fraud and Legal Compliance Department immediately. A cold, heavy stone dropped in my stomach. I hit refresh. The page reloaded, displaying the exact same terrifying zeros. My fingers flew across the keyboard, opening my secondary accounts. frozen, restricted, zero balance. I grabbed my phone and dialed the bank's emergency customer service line. My pulse pounded in my ears as I navigated the automated menus, finally demanding to speak to a human representative. A representative named Sarah answered. I verified my identity, keeping my voice as calm and professional as possible, and asked why my accounts were locked. I heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard on her end of the line. The brief silence that followed was agonizing. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was laced with an uncomfortable, apologetic tone. She explained that the bank had received an emergency court order just 2 hours prior. An ex parte motion had been filed in the county court by a massive corporate law firm representing Jason. The legal maneuver was a specialized, aggressive injunction designed to freeze assets without giving the defending party any prior notice or opportunity to object. According to the court filing, Jason and his lawyers claimed I was actively misusing child support funds. They alleged I was an unstable flight risk draining resources to fund a dangerous lifestyle and requested an immediate asset freeze to prevent me from hiding the money. The sheer malice of the strategy hit me like a physical blow. The ambush at the school courtyard had just been a distraction. While Jason and Brittany were busy performing for the cameras and trying to provoke a public meltdown, Jason's legal team was quietly executing a financial assassination. They had timed it perfectly. They locked my accounts right before the close of business on a Tuesday, knowing it would take days for me to even get a hearing to contest the freeze. They had intentionally severed my financial lifeline at the exact moment they hit me with a massive custody lawsuit. I hung up the phone and stared at the blank wall of my kitchen. The physical anxiety of being a single mother financially paralyzed completely overtook me. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in. My chest tightened, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I was a trained investigator, a former military intelligence specialist who had operated in hostile territories. I knew how to handle physical danger. I knew how to analyze threats and neutralize enemies in a combat zone. But this was a completely different kind of terror. This was the terrifying, suffocating reality of legal bullying. Jason had effectively weaponized the justice system against me, turning the very institutions meant to protect families into a blunt instrument to destroy mine. Without access to my accounts, I could not pay the $10,000 legal retainer. Without a lawyer, I could not fight the ex parte order or the custody battle. Without my funds, I could not buy groceries for Leo, put gas in my car, or pay the utility bills due at the end of the week. Jason had stripped me of my ability to defend myself, fight for my son, or even survive the next 48 hours. He wanted to starve me out. He wanted me to look at my son, realize I could not afford to feed him, and crawl back to the negotiation table, begging for mercy, willing to sign over full custody, just to ensure my child had a roof over his head. I walked over to the doorway and watched Leo tracing shapes on his sketch pad, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine that had just dropped on our lives. A profound, terrifying isolation settled over my shoulders. I had no access to cash. My credit cards were linked to the frozen accounts. I was completely boxed in. Jason had orchestrated a masterclass in domestic warfare, using his immense corporate wealth to silence me before I could even step foot inside a courtroom. The panic threatened to pull me under, wrapping its icy fingers around my throat as I stared at the red restricted warning on my laptop screen. The sharp, piercing chime of the doorbell shattered the suffocating silence of my kitchen, ripping my attention away from the red, restricted warning on my laptop screen. I flinched, my heart hammering a frantic new rhythm against my ribs. I glanced quickly toward the living room to ensure Leo was still thoroughly engrossed in his cartoon, his small back turned to the entryway. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, I pushed myself up from the table, ignoring the sharp flare of pain radiating through my right leg. I walked down the narrow hallway and peered through the security peephole. The breath completely vanished from my lungs. Standing on my front porch, illuminated by the fading afternoon light, was Jason. And standing right beside him, clutching a designer handbag and wearing an expression of absolute disgust, was my mother, Patricia. For a fraction of a second, my mind simply refused to process the image. My biological mother and the man who had abandoned me and her grandson were standing shoulder to shoulder on my porch. The ultimate, unthinkable betrayal stared back at me through that tiny glass lens. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, keeping my body firmly planted in the threshold to block their entry. I demanded to know what they were doing here. Patricia did not wait for an invitation. She pushed forward with the entitled arrogance she carried everywhere, her expensive perfume instantly overpowering the fresh air. She brushed right past my shoulder, forcing her way into my front hallway, with Jason trailing closely behind her like a smug, well-dressed shadow. I closed the door, my jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. I asked her exactly what she was doing here and, more importantly, why she was standing next to the man who had destroyed our family. Patricia slowly turned around, her eyes raking over my modest home with thinly veiled contempt. She took in the scuffed hardwood floors, the simple furniture, and finally my faded t-shirt and tactical boots. She let out a heavy theatrical sigh of profound disappointment. She told me to stop being so terribly dramatic, claiming she was here as a voice of reason, because I had clearly lost my grip on reality. Jason stood slightly behind her right shoulder, crossing his arms, and flashing that same sickening smile he had worn in the school courtyard. He had brought his ultimate weapon. He knew that nothing shattered a person faster than their own mother turning against them. I demanded that they lower their voices and get out of my house before I called the police. Patricia stepped closer, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing the air between us. She hissed that I would do no such thing, insisting that she was here to protect her grandson from a miserable existence. She proudly announced that she had been working with Jason and his legal team for weeks. She had signed the sworn affidavits supporting his emergency custody petition. My own flesh and blood had actively conspired to orchestrate my financial and maternal ruin. The room spun slightly, but I locked my knees and stood my ground. I asked her how she could possibly side with a man who had drained my accounts and left me for his assistant while I was bleeding in a military trauma unit. Patricia rolled her eyes, waving away my trauma as if it were a minor inconvenience. She claimed Jason had simply made a difficult business decision during a highly stressful time, and that I was selfishly holding on to ancient history to play the victim. She began pacing my small living room, gesturing wildly toward the modest space. She told me to look around and compare this pathetic, cramped box to the life Jason and Brittany could offer Leo. She vividly described their sprawling multi-million-dollar estate, the private tennis courts, the heated infinity pool, and the elite social circles they moved in. She looked me up and down, her gaze dripping with maternal venom. She asked me what I could possibly offer a growing boy, pointing out that my bank accounts were frozen, and my career consisted of obscure government contracts that nobody understood. She praised Brittany, calling her vibrant, young, and perfectly suited to host the kinds of social events that build a child's future network. Patricia explicitly stated that Leo needed a mother who belonged at country club luncheons, not one who shopped at discount grocery stores and wore combat boots. I told her she was completely delusional if she thought wealth replaced a mother's love. I reminded her that Jason had ignored Leo for 4 years, only showing up now to play Father of the Year. Patricia stepped directly into my personal space, her voice dropping into a harsh, cruel whisper designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. She told me that love did not pay for Ivy League tuitions or secure a place in polite society. Then she delivered the killing blow. She looked at my injured leg, her lip curling in absolute disgust. She called me a damaged soldier. She said I had thrown away every opportunity she had given me, refusing to marry well, refusing to work a respectable corporate job, and instead choosing to play hero in the military. She spat out that I had brought nothing but shame to our family name, returning home physically broken and mentally unstable. She told me that I was a complete embarrassment, a crippled veteran who woke up screaming from nightmares, and that it was absolute child abuse to subject her grandson to my trauma. Every word was a calculated strike designed to break my spirit and force a surrender. She demanded that I sign over full custody to Jason, immediately threatening to take the stand in federal court and testify under oath that I was an unfit, violent, and dangerous mother. She promised to tell the judge that my military service had left me dangerously unhinged. She and Jason had built a flawless trap, sealing off my money and weaponizing my own mother to isolate me completely. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling a profound, icy disconnect. She was not a mother, she was a mercenary. Jason chuckled softly from the doorway, crossing his arms over his expensive suit. He confidently added that I was entirely out of options. He reminded me that the bank accounts were locked, the legal fees were insurmountable, and now my own family was ready to publicly testify to my incompetence. The physical pain in my leg pulsed in rhythm with my racing heart. Patricia folded her arms, demanding I fetch a pen and sign the preliminary custody surrender documents Jason had brought with him. She insisted it was the only way I could save myself from a grueling public trial that would leave me absolutely destitute. The suffocating weight of their combined cruelty was meant to paralyze me, to extinguish any remaining spark of resistance I held inside. I looked down at the expensive gold pen Jason had casually tossed onto my coffee table, right next to the thick stack of legal documents. The papers were neatly tabbed with bright yellow sticky notes, indicating exactly where I was supposed to sign away my rights to my own flesh and blood. Patricia took a step forward, her shadow falling across the pages. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, glaring at me with an intensity that felt entirely foreign. This was the woman who had taught me how to tie my shoes. Yet right now she looked at me as if I were an insect she wanted to crush beneath her designer heel. She did not wait for me to speak. The silence in the room was clearly making Jason impatient, and Patricia was desperate to prove her usefulness to him. She leaned in closer, her voice dripping with a toxic blend of pity and supreme arrogance. She told me that I had brought every single piece of this nightmare upon myself. She declared that the divorce, the financial ruin, and the impending loss of my son were the direct consequences of my own profound selfishness. I stood frozen, the accusation ringing in my ears. I asked her how she could possibly call me selfish when I had sacrificed my body to serve my country, and when I had spent the last 4 years raising Leo entirely on my own, while his father ignored his very existence. Patricia laughed. It was a sharp, humorless sound that echoed off the walls of my small living room. She shook her head, treating me like an obstinate child who simply refused to understand how the real world operated. She raised her voice, ensuring her words would inflict maximum damage. She explicitly blamed me for the destruction of my marriage. She told me that Jason was a wealthy, successful man who needed a wife to support his ambitions, host his corporate dinners, and maintain a beautiful home. Instead of fulfilling my duties as a wife, she sneered, I had chosen to run off to a war zone. I had chosen to put on a uniform and play soldier just to prove some ridiculous point to the world. She looked at Jason, offering him a sympathetic nod before turning her venom back on me. She said that no self-respecting man of his stature would sit around waiting for a wife who prioritized a dangerous masculine fantasy over her own family. She insisted that Jason stepping out of the marriage and finding comfort with Brittany was not a betrayal, but an inevitable reaction to my neglect. According to my own mother, I had practically forced him into the arms of his assistant because I was too stubborn to stay home and be the kind of woman he actually needed. The sheer absurdity of her logic made my head spin. She was actively defending the man who had abandoned his infant son, framing his adultery and financial theft as the reasonable actions of a neglected husband. She was entirely rewriting history to make Jason the victim and me the villain. She even went as far as to praise Brittany, calling her a vibrant, dedicated young woman who was eager to step up and give Leo the traditional stable household that I had selfishly denied him. Jason shifted his weight, clearly enjoying the performance. He adjusted his watch and added that he had tried to give me a perfect life, but I was too obsessed with chasing adrenaline. He told Patricia that he was just grateful she finally saw the truth of the situation. They were feeding off each other, building a shared delusion right in front of me. Patricia stepped between us, aggressively demanding my attention. She raised her manicured hand and began listing the exact ways she planned to destroy my credibility in federal court. She detailed her testimony with terrifying precision. She promised to take the stand under oath and swear to the judge that I had been emotionally unstable long before my deployment. She threatened to tell the court that my combat injuries had completely shattered whatever fragile sanity I had left. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a harsh, menacing hiss. She told me she would testify that I routinely experienced violent night terrors, that I was prone to explosive fits of rage, and that she personally feared for her grandson's physical safety when he was alone with me. She promised to paint a picture of a broken, unpredictable veteran who was a ticking time bomb. She said she would describe the condition of my house as squalid and unsafe, deliberately ignoring the fact that Jason had just frozen my bank accounts to manufacture that exact reality. I asked her how she could sleep at night, knowing she was planning to commit perjury to help a criminal steal her own grandson. I begged her to look at me to see her daughter, and to remember the truth of who I actually was. Patricia did not flinch. Her expression remained entirely devoid of maternal affection. She stated coldly that truth was highly subjective, and the only truth the judge would care about was the testimony of a concerned grandmother trying to protect an innocent child from a dangerous environment. She reiterated that Jason had the financial means to drag this out for years to hire the best psychological experts money could buy, and to ensure I was buried under a mountain of legal debt. She pointed at the pen again, her voice rising to a frantic, commanding pitch. She ordered me to stop being a stubborn fool and sign the papers. She told me that if I forced them to go to trial, they would not just take Leo, they would ensure I never saw him unsupervised ever again. They would strip me of my dignity, my rights, and my future. She framed her vicious threats as an act of maternal mercy, claiming she was giving me the chance to walk away with a tiny shred of self-respect rather than being publicly humiliated in a courtroom. I was completely cornered. The onslaught of emotional abuse was relentless, battering against the mental walls I had erected. My injured leg was screaming in pain from standing rigid for so long, and the terrifying reality of my frozen bank accounts loomed in the back of my mind. Jason stood there with a triumphant smirk, looking at me like a predator watching a trapped animal bleed out. My own mother had just handed him the weapon to execute my maternal rights. The air in the room grew thin, heavy with the suffocating realization that they had meticulously planned this psychological execution, and they fully expected me to break. The heavy silence in my living room was shattered by Jason letting out a sharp, impatient sigh. He picked up the expensive gold pen from the coffee table and thrust it directly toward me. He demanded that I stop wasting his valuable time, reiterating that the ex parte order had already frozen my bank accounts completely. He reminded me that Patricia was fully prepared to testify against my sanity in front of a federal judge. He ordered me to sign the custody surrender documents right that second, claiming it was the absolute only way to avoid financial ruin and total public humiliation. Patricia stood right beside him, nodding in firm agreement, her eyes coldly expectant and devoid of any maternal warmth. I looked at the pen, then at the towering stack of legal documents. The physical pain in my injured leg was throbbing violently as the psychological weight of their meticulously planned trap threatened to crush the last ounce of breathable air from my lungs. Just as Jason aggressively shoved the pen closer to my trembling hand, a deafening crash echoed through the entire house. The solid wood of my front door flew open with such violent, unexpected force that the heavy brass hinges groaned and the doorknob slammed forcefully against the drywall in the entryway. Jason jumped backward, genuinely startled by the sudden explosion of noise. Patricia let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching her chest and stumbling away from the coffee table. Standing in the entryway, completely filling the frame of the broken door, was Jamal. My 38-year-old brother-in-law was a deeply imposing figure. As an African-American former military judge, Advocate General Jamal possessed a commanding, razor-sharp presence that instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. He did not simply walk into a space, he secured it. Right behind him was my older sister, Naomi. Her eyes immediately found me standing cornered by the coffee table, and she sprinted across the living room. She shoved aggressively past our toxic mother without saying a single word, wrapping her arms protectively around my shoulders and physically pulling me away from the dangerous legal documents. Jamal stepped fully into the living room, his intense gaze sweeping over the chaotic scene with the cold, calculating precision of a highly seasoned combat lawyer. He took in the frozen, panicked stance of Jason, the arrogant but fearful posture of Patricia, and the custody surrender documents scattered across the table. His jaw locked tightly. Jason quickly tried to recover his smug, corporate demeanor. He puffed out his chest, adjusted his tie, and demanded to know what Jamal thought he was doing. He threatened to call the police right then and there for breaking and entering into a private residence. Jamal did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He stepped directly into Jason's personal space, moving with a quiet, lethal grace that forced the wealthy financial executive to crane his neck slightly upward. Jamal spoke with a chilling, heavily controlled cadence that cut through the tension in the room like a surgical scalpel. He informed Jason that calling the police was actually an excellent idea. Jamal generously offered to dial the emergency number himself so they could have a lengthy discussion with law enforcement about state penal codes regarding criminal trespass, aggravated harassment, and the explicit extortion and coercion of a disabled military veteran inside her own home. He pointed a steady, unwavering finger at the custody surrender papers resting on the table. He stated clearly that attempting to force a signature under the direct threat of financial starvation and perjured testimony was not just an aggressive corporate negotiation tactic. He declared it a severe violation of federal extortion laws and a blatant display of witness intimidation. Patricia attempted to intervene, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to reassert her crumbling maternal authority. She told Jamal to stay out of private family business, falsely claiming they were simply trying to negotiate a peaceful, reasonable resolution for the sake of her grandson. Jamal turned his piercing, unyielding gaze directly onto her, and Patricia instantly shrank back, her false bravado evaporating. He told my mother that her specific definition of a peaceful resolution sounded exactly like witness tampering and conspiracy to commit fraud. He informed her with absolute terrifying clarity that if she ever stepped foot on this property again, or if she dared to utter a single perjured statement about my mental health in any courtroom, he would personally ensure she faced criminal charges for falsifying a sworn legal affidavit. He promised to rip her carefully crafted socialite reputation to shreds and leave her facing a mandatory minimum prison sentence for conspiracy. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but the absolute unwavering certainty in Jamal's eyes silenced her completely. She took a hurried, stumbling step backward, suddenly realizing that the vicious legal game she thought she was playing carried very real, very terrifying consequences that her wealth could not buy her out of. Jamal turned his undivided attention back to Jason. He stepped forward, utilizing his imposing physical presence to back Jason away from the coffee table and straight toward the front hallway. He did not lay a single finger on him, but the sheer overwhelming force of his authority forced Jason to retreat step by step. Jamal dictated the new reality of the situation with brutal, unyielding legal precision. He acknowledged the malicious ex parte motion that froze my bank accounts loudly, calling it a cheap, cowardly trick designed by bloated corporate attorneys who did not know how to survive a real war. Then Jamal made his official, undeniable declaration. His deep voice echoed through the narrow hallway as he announced that as of this exact second, he was my official attorney of record. He stated firmly that he was taking my entire custody defense case and all subsequent counterclaims entirely pro bono. He promised Jason that there would be no more financial starvation, no more forced settlements, and absolutely no surrender. He vowed to file an emergency injunction by morning to unfreeze the banking accounts and promised to drag Jason's entire legal team before the state disciplinary board to answer for their highly unethical tactics. Jason backed up until his expensive leather shoes hit the threshold of the broken front door. Patricia scurried out quickly behind him, practically running down the concrete driveway to escape the overwhelming, suffocating intensity of the confrontation. Jason stood on the porch, his face pale and slick with sweat. His carefully orchestrated ambush had been completely dismantled by a man who knew the law significantly better than anyone he had ever hired. He tried to smooth the lapels of his custom suit jacket, desperately attempting to salvage a tiny shred of his shattered ego. He glared venomously at Jamal, then looked past him to where Naomi was holding me tightly in the living room. His upper lip curled into a vicious, hateful sneer. "I will bury you both in court." Jason turned on his heel and marched toward his luxury sedan, his arrogant threat hanging in the cool evening air. The heavy silence in my living room finally broke the moment Jason's taillights vanished down the street. Jamal turned to me, his expression resolute, and told me to gather my files because we were going to war. The following weeks disappeared into a relentless blur of legal strategy counterfilings and late-night preparations at Jamal's dining room table. We managed to secure an emergency hearing to unfreeze my bank accounts, severely reprimanding Jason's attorneys for their malicious ex parte maneuver. But the real battlefield awaited us in the formal discovery phase. That battle began on a rainy Thursday morning inside a sterile, overly air-conditioned conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise. I sat rigidly in a heavy leather chair, staring across the massive mahogany table. The air was thick and heavy, vibrating with an almost suffocating tension. On my side of the table sat Jamal, a fortress of absolute calm, organizing his legal pads with meticulous precision. On the opposite side sat a miniature corporate army. Jason leaned back in his chair, exuding arrogant confidence in a charcoal gray suit. Brittany sat directly beside him, her arms crossed tight, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the polished wood. She wore a bright red dress that seemed aggressively out of place for a legal deposition, her eyes practically shining with malicious anticipation. Flanking them were three highly paid corporate attorneys. The lead counsel, a ruthless, sharp-featured man named Carver, sat directly across from me. He arranged his expensive fountain pens and stared at me with the predatory calculation of a man accustomed to breaking people for a living. The court reporter signaled she was ready, and Carver wasted absolutely no time. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the mahogany surface, and began the interrogation. His strategy was immediately apparent. He was not there to ask legitimate questions about my parenting abilities or my relationship with Leo. He was there to execute a targeted psychological assault. He wanted to push every conceivable button, hoping to trigger a volatile reaction that the court reporter would permanently record as undeniable evidence of my mental instability. Carver started by dissecting my financial situation loudly, pointing out that I had required my brother-in-law to rescue me from total financial ruin. I kept my voice perfectly level, answering only with facts, stating that my financial vulnerability was a direct result of his client illegally freezing my assets. Carver simply smirked and pivoted his attack toward his real target. He opened a thick file folder and began reading excerpts from my military service record, purposely twisting my combat commendations into a false narrative of intense psychological damage. He asked me to describe the exact moment the explosive device hit my convoy overseas. I felt Jamal stiffen beside me, immediately raising a sharp formal objection regarding relevance and harassment. Carver waved the objection away with a dismissive hand, claiming my combat history was directly relevant to my current mental state as a caregiver. He looked at me with faux sympathy, his voice dripping with weaponized condescension. He asked if I still heard the explosion when I closed my eyes at night. He asked how often I experienced debilitating flashbacks. He leaned closer across the mahogany table, invading my personal space, and aggressively questioned whether a woman who had seen such horrific violence could ever truly provide a safe, peaceful environment for a young, impressionable child. My heart beat a steady, controlled rhythm against my ribs. I stared directly into Carver's predatory eyes and answered with absolute clarity. I stated that my military service had taught me discipline, resilience, and the true meaning of protecting the innocent. I told him my experiences made me a far stronger mother, not a broken one. Carver's jaw tightened. He did not like my iron composure. He decided to rapidly escalate his tactics. He picked up a massive, heavy legal binder and intentionally slammed it down flat against the mahogany table. The sudden, deafening crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent conference room. Brittany jumped in her seat. Jason flinched visibly, but I did not move a single muscle. My rigorous military training had conditioned me to remain perfectly still under direct fire. I did not blink, and I did not break eye contact with the lead attorney. Jamal instantly leaned forward, his deep voice low and incredibly dangerous, warning opposing counsel that if he resorted to cheap theatrical intimidation tactics again, this deposition would be suspended immediately and severe sanctions would be filed with the State Bar Association. Carver offered a hollow, insincere apology, claiming the binder slipped from his hands, but the malicious gleam in his eyes told an entirely different story. He quickly resumed his questioning, shifting his focus to my physical injuries. He demanded to know exactly how much weight I could lift with my damaged leg. He asked maliciously what would happen if Leo ran toward a busy street and my crippled knee gave out while I tried to chase him. He painted a terrifying fabricated scenario of my son getting hit by a car simply because his mother was too physically broken to save him. The question was vile. It was designed to strike at the deepest, most primal fears of any parent. I saw Jason smirk from the corner of my eye, clearly enjoying the psychological torture his money was currently buying. Brittany leaned forward, watching me intently, practically holding her breath as she waited for the inevitable tears to fall. She desperately wanted me to scream. She wanted me to launch myself across the table. She wanted me to prove their terrible narrative right. I took a slow, measured breath, drawing upon every ounce of strength I had cultivated during my agonizing physical therapy sessions. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, refusing to give them even the tiny satisfaction of seeing my knuckles turn white. I answered Carver with a voice as cold and hard as steel. I informed him that I was fully capable of protecting my son from any threat, whether it was a busy street or a room full of manipulative cowards trying to steal him. Jamal nodded subtly beside me, a silent gesture of absolute professional approval. He knew exactly what Carver was attempting to do, and he was expertly managing the flow of the deposition, issuing precise legal objections that repeatedly disrupted Carver's aggressive rhythm. Every time Carver tried to corner me with a hypothetical, emotionally manipulative scenario, Jamal forcefully shut it down, citing strict legal precedent and demanding opposing counsel stick to established facts rather than cruel fiction. Carver was growing visibly agitated. His expensive suit jacket looked a little tighter around his shoulders, and a thin sheen of sweat had formed on his forehead. He had spent the last 2 hours throwing everything he had at me. He had used sudden loud noises, aggressive physical posturing, and deeply personal insults, poorly disguised as legitimate legal inquiries. He had tried to weaponize my combat trauma and my physical scars, expecting me to crumble into a sobbing, hysterical mess that they could use to destroy my custody rights forever. Instead, he found himself facing an impenetrable, unyielding wall. I answered every single question with concise, factual, emotionless precision. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry, and I never once broke eye contact with the man trying to ruin my life. Jason's smug confidence began to noticeably waver. He shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair, loosening his tie and whispering frantically to a junior lawyer sitting next to him. The corporate team had severely underestimated their target. They thought they were breaking down a vulnerable, defenseless civilian, completely unaware of the intense mental fortitude required to survive the hostile environments I had successfully operated in. But the psychological warfare in that deposition room was far from over, and Carver was preparing to play his final, most devastating card against me. Carver stopped his aggressive pacing and let out a slow, deliberate breath. He adjusted his suit jacket, signaling a shift in his tactics. He turned away from me, walked over to his leather briefcase resting on the corner of the table, and unclasped the heavy brass locks. The distinct metallic sound echoed in the quiet room. Jason leaned forward, mirroring his lawyer's sudden shift in energy. Brittany actually smiled, a terrifying stretch of her painted lips that told me they were about to execute the main event of this ambush. Carver reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily bound dossier. It had a stark white cover with bold red lettering stamped across the front, designed to look highly classified and deeply official. He held it up for a moment, letting the weight of the document hang in the air before sliding it across the polished mahogany table directly toward Jamal and me. The folder stopped precisely halfway between us. Jamal did not reach for it immediately. He kept his eyes locked on Carver, his posture radiating a cold, lethal warning. I stared at the stark white cover. Carver settled back into his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. He announced that his legal team had recently acquired an independent comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation regarding my current state of health. He stated that the evaluation was conducted by a highly respected private psychiatric specialist who had reviewed my military files, my emergency room admission records, and my physical therapy progress reports. He claimed this specialist had compiled a definitive, undeniable assessment of my maternal fitness. Jamal finally reached out and pulled the thick dossier toward our side of the table. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the first few pages with rapid analytical precision. I watched his jaw clench. The muscle in his cheek twitched, a rare display of genuine fury from my normally stoic brother-in-law. He slid the open folder toward me. I looked down at the crisp, professional letterhead of a private medical clinic I had never visited in my entire life. Beneath the clinic logo was a signature belonging to a doctor I had never met or spoken to. I read the bold, underlined text at the top of the executive summary. The fabricated document diagnosed me with severe violent post-traumatic stress disorder. It claimed my combat injuries had resulted in permanent degenerative physical disability that rendered me incapable of basic physical exertion. As my eyes darted down the page, the lies grew exponentially worse. The forged psychiatric evaluation explicitly stated that I was prone to unpredictable, explosive, violent outbursts. It falsely detailed fabricated episodes where I supposedly lost touch with reality, hallucinated, and reacted with intense aggression to everyday stimuli. The final paragraph of the summary delivered the killing blow. It concluded in clinical, legally binding language that I represented a direct, immediate, and unavoidable danger to the physical and emotional safety of my son. The sheer audacity of the fabrication took my breath away. They had not just exaggerated my actual injuries, they had commissioned a completely fraudulent medical dossier from a corrupt, high-priced private doctor to scientifically brand me a monster. Jason was attempting to use my honorable military service as the foundation for a masterclass in legal fiction. He wanted to officially record me as a violent threat, so the court would have absolutely no choice but to strip me of all parental rights immediately. Carver leaned across the table, tapping a finger against the polished wood. He spoke with a sickeningly compassionate tone, loudly stating for the court reporter to hear that it was a tragedy what the war had done to my mind. He claimed his client Jason was simply terrified for his son's safety. Carver argued that this independent medical evaluation proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I could snap at any given moment. He painted a horrifying, completely fictional scenario where a loud noise like a dropping book or a slamming door could send me into a violent flashback, potentially harming Leo in the process. My hands rested on my lap, my nails digging sharply into my own palms. I had to force my breathing to remain steady, inhaling through my nose and exhaling slowly through my mouth. If I showed even a fraction of the burning rage consuming my chest, Carver would point to it as proof of the explosive anger detailed in their forged report. I kept my face utterly impassive, channeling every ounce of discipline I possessed to stare blankly at the fraudulent pages. Jamal did not bother containing his outrage. He slammed his hand flat against the open dossier, his voice dropping an octave into a terrifying, commanding boom. He demanded to know exactly how opposing counsel obtained a medical evaluation from a physician who had never once treated, interviewed, or even been in the same room as his client. He correctly identified the document as a bought and paid-for piece of legal fiction, a blatant fabrication designed to extort a custody surrender. Jamal informed Carver that submitting unverified fraudulent medical records during a sworn deposition was a direct violation of civil procedure and a matter he would escalate to a federal judge by the end of the day. Carver did not flinch. He maintained his arrogant smirk, smoothly responding that the doctor was a highly credentialed expert witness who frequently provided remote evaluations based on comprehensive file reviews. He claimed the methodology was entirely legal and standard practice in high-stakes custody disputes. He then confidently announced that this expert witness was already scheduled to testify under oath at the upcoming emergency custody hearing. Carver made it perfectly clear that they were fully prepared to put this corrupt doctor on the stand to swear before a judge that I was a violent, disabled, and fundamentally broken woman who posed an active threat to her own child. The room grew colder. Jason sat back, crossing his arms over his chest, shooting me a look of absolute triumph. He believed he had just checkmated me. He believed that no family court judge would ever risk leaving a 5-year-old boy in the custody of a combat veteran carrying a severe violent psychiatric diagnosis from a credentialed expert. He had spent a fortune to buy a medical lie that could legally destroy me. He thought he had completely backed me into a corner from which there was no possible escape, leaving me financially ruined, socially isolated, and legally branded as a dangerous liability. Brittany leaned closer to Jason, resting her hand on his arm, her eyes shining with malicious victory. She was already picturing Leo living in her meticulously decorated mansion, cementing her status as the perfect rescuing stepmother. The trap was sprung. The fake evidence was on the table, and they were merely waiting for me to surrender. I stared at the forged signature at the bottom of the page, recognizing the immense, terrifying power of the lie they had just constructed. They had officially escalated the conflict from aggressive litigation to outright criminal fraud, risking everything to break me completely. The heavy silence following Carver's threat was abruptly broken by the rustle of expensive leather. Brittany shifted in her seat, deciding it was her turn to twist the knife. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag and pulled out a glossy, high-resolution photo portfolio. With a dramatic sweeping motion of her arm, she slid the heavy portfolio across the polished mahogany table. It glided smoothly, coming to a halt directly next to the fabricated psychiatric dossier. Brittany leaned forward, pressing her hands flat against the table. The overwhelming scent of her floral perfume invaded my space, thick and cloying. She tapped her manicured index finger against the glossy cover of the portfolio, her lips curling into a vicious, triumphant smile. She did not speak to Jamal or address the lawyers in the room. Her eyes were locked entirely on me, burning with an intense, malicious glee. She commanded me to open it, claiming she wanted me to see exactly what kind of future I was trying to steal from my own son. I kept my expression entirely blank as I reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. The pages were filled with professional wide-angle photographs of a massive custom-built child's bedroom inside their sprawling new mansion. The sheer scale of the wealth on display was staggering. The room was the size of my entire ground floor. It featured a custom-crafted loft bed shaped like a spaceship, complete with a built-in slide and a rock-climbing wall. One photograph showed a walk-in closet overflowing with brand-new designer clothes, expensive sneakers, and rows of pristine, untouched toys, still in their original packaging. Another picture displayed a private ensuite bathroom with a massive soaking tub and custom tile work. The final photo captured a panoramic view from the bedroom window looking out over a perfectly manicured lawn, a private tennis court, and a sparkling infinity pool. Brittany watched my eyes scan the images. She began narrating the photos with a sickeningly sweet voice, boasting about how they had hired a top-tier luxury interior designer to create the ultimate childhood paradise. She detailed the cost of the imported furniture, the specialized lighting, and the expensive educational electronics she had personally selected. She painted a picture of absolute unmatched privilege. She told the room that this was the environment Leo truly deserved, an environment filled with endless resources, elite opportunities, and absolute physical safety. She contrasted her lavish descriptions by loudly reminding everyone of my modest 2-bedroom house, my tight budget, and my frozen bank accounts. Then Brittany dropped the sweet stepmother facade entirely. She leaned in even closer across the wide mahogany table, invading my personal space until her face was mere inches from the invisible boundary separating our sides. Her voice dropped into a harsh, venomous whisper intended strictly for me to hear over the scratching of the court reporter's machine. She told me to look closely at myself. She told me to think about my limp, my nightmares, and my physical limitations. She hissed that little boys have boundless energy, and they desperately need a mother who can actually keep up with them. She stated with absolute chilling cruelty that children need a whole, healthy mother who can run, play, and protect them without collapsing in pain. She looked directly at my injured leg, her eyes filled with supreme disgust. She told me that I was nothing but a damaged veteran, a liability who would only hold Leo back and embarrass him in front of his peers. Then she delivered a line so incredibly vile, it made the air in the room turn to ice. She explicitly called me a broken toy. She whispered that every child eventually gets tired of playing with broken toys and that they always throw them away for something shiny and new. She promised me that if I forced Leo to stay in my miserable, broken world, he would grow up to resent me, hate me, and eventually discard me just like Jason did. Jamal shifted violently in his chair beside me. I could feel the intense, boiling heat of his rage radiating outward. His large hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He was a fraction of a second away from halting the deposition and demanding Brittany be removed from the room for gross emotional harassment. But I placed my hand firmly over his forearm, applying a steady downward pressure. I needed him to let her finish. I needed her to lay all her cards on the table. Seeing that I was not reacting, Brittany decided to drop the ultimate threat. She reached out and tapped her manicured nails sharply against the cover of the forged medical dossier containing the fake severe PTSD diagnosis. She abandoned the whispers and raised her voice, ensuring her ultimatum echoed loudly off the conference room walls. She announced that her legal team had already drafted a comprehensive report attaching the fabricated psychiatric evaluation as the primary evidence. She told me they had the entire package ready to submit directly to Child Protective Services. She threatened that if I did not surrender today, if I forced them to go to a full trial, they would hand that file over to state agents immediately. She described with horrifying detail how Child Protective Services would respond to a report of a highly volatile, physically disabled combat veteran suffering from violent explosive PTSD episodes. She guaranteed that state agents would arrive at my house with a police escort, physically remove Leo from my care, and place him in emergency protective custody before the weekend was over. Brittany leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with an air of absolute untouchable supremacy. She laid out the final, devastating ultimatum. She told me that if Child Protective Services took my son based on a violent psychiatric diagnosis, I would not just lose primary custody. I would be stripped of all visitation rights forever. I would be legally branded an active danger to a minor. I would never be allowed to see, speak to, or hold my son ever again. Carver, the lead attorney, smoothly slid a pre-drafted, finalized custody surrender agreement across the table, placing it directly over the photos of the lavish bedroom. He then placed Jason's heavy gold fountain pen right on top of the signature line. Brittany delivered her closing demand. She ordered me to pick up the pen and sign over full custody immediately. She promised that if I walked away quietly today, surrendered my rights, and disappeared from their lives, they would bury the fake medical file and allow me to see Leo on supervised holidays. But if I refused to sign, they would hit send on the report to Child Protective Services by 5 o'clock. They would annihilate my entire existence, strip my child away by force, and destroy my life so completely I would never recover. The threat hung heavy in the sterile air, a brutal, uncompromising demand for total surrender. The absolute silence in the conference room was shattered by the sharp scraping of a chair leg against the floor. Jamal moved. The terrifying restraint he had maintained for the past 2 hours vanished in a single explosive fraction of a second. His massive frame shifted upward, his muscles coiling tight beneath his tailored suit. He was no longer just my brother-in-law. He was a seasoned military prosecutor who had just witnessed a blatant, undeniable act of criminal extortion happen right in front of him. I could see the lethal calculation behind his dark eyes as he prepared to rip the opposing counsel apart piece by piece. He was ready to scorch the earth to demand the immediate confiscation of the forged medical dossier and to report Carver directly to the ethics board for attempting to use a fabricated psychiatric evaluation to blackmail a mother into surrendering her child. The righteous fury radiating from Jamal was entirely justified, a blazing inferno ready to consume the arrogant corporate lawyers sitting across from us. Before Jamal could open his mouth to unleash absolute hell, I raised my left hand. I moved smoothly and deliberately, placing my palm flat against his tense forearm. My touch was light but incredibly firm. The physical contact sent an immediate message that he understood instinctively. Stand down. Hold your fire. Jamal froze, his intense gaze snapping down to my hand and then up to my face. He saw the profound fundamental shift that had just occurred within me. He saw that the frightened, cornered single mother they had been relentlessly bullying was gone. The defensive posture I had maintained since the ambush in the school courtyard dissolved completely. My shoulders relaxed, dropping the rigid tension I had carried for weeks. My breathing slowed, evening out into the rhythmic, controlled pattern of a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. The agonizing pain in my injured leg faded into a dull, distant throb, completely overshadowed by the icy clarity flooding my veins. I let go of Jamal's arm and leaned forward. I placed both of my hands flat on the polished mahogany table, mirroring the aggressive stance Brittany had taken just moments before. But unlike her frantic, perfume-drenched theatrical display, my movements were precise, quiet, and loaded with dangerous intent. I claimed my physical space at the table, forcing the three corporate lawyers to subconsciously lean back in their expensive leather chairs. I ignored Brittany completely. She was a pawn, a vain distraction who had outlived her usefulness the second she stopped talking. I bypassed Carver and his stack of legal maneuvers. I locked my eyes directly onto Jason. He was sitting there with a triumphant, victorious gleam in his eyes, expecting to see the final, shattering culmination of his psychological warfare. He expected to see me reach for the heavy gold fountain pen with trembling fingers. He fully anticipated watching me sign away my rights, my son, and my future out of sheer, unadulterated terror. He wanted a broken victim. Instead, I gave him a smile. It was not a smile of defeat or forced politeness. It was a chilling, dead-eyed, razor-sharp smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the expression of a soldier who had just watched the enemy walk blindly into a carefully laid minefield. Jason hesitated. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for a split second. His brow furrowed in confusion, his brain struggling to process the sudden jarring lack of fear in my demeanor. I held his gaze, refusing to blink, letting the heavy, terrifying silence stretch out until the atmosphere in the room became incredibly uncomfortable. When I finally spoke, my voice was void of any emotion. It held no anger, no panic, and absolutely no hesitation. The words dropped onto the mahogany table like shards of solid ice. "Submit it to the federal judge," I said, my voice echoing clearly for the court reporter to transcribe. "I do not settle." The entire room jolted as if struck by a physical blow. Carver's head snapped up from his legal pad, his eyes widening in shock. Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, completely baffled by my refusal to bow to her devastating ultimatum. Even the court reporter paused her typing for a fraction of a second, stunned by the sheer audacity of my response. I slowly pushed the finalized custody surrender agreement away from me, sliding the heavy gold fountain pen back across the table until it stopped directly in front of Jason. I kept my eyes locked on his, ensuring he understood the absolute finality of my decision. I told him that he had spent a fortune trying to paint me as a damaged, unstable liability. I invited him to take his fabricated medical dossier, his highly paid expert witness, and his empty threats directly into a federal courtroom. I dared him to put that forged document into the official court record. I made it explicitly clear that I would not surrender my son today, tomorrow, or ever. Jason stared at the pen sitting in front of him, then looked back up at me. His initial shock rapidly morphed into something else entirely. His ego, bloated by years of corporate dominance and unchecked greed, aggressively rejected the reality of the situation. He could not fathom that I was actually challenging him. In his mind, I was just a desperate, broke woman making a pathetic last-ditch attempt to save face in front of her lawyer. A slow, vicious smirk spread across Jason's face. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a delusional child. He leaned back in his chair, exuding a renewed sense of arrogant superiority. He looked at Carver, exchanging a knowing, incredibly smug glance with his lead attorney. They silently agreed that my refusal was nothing more than a foolish, suicidal bluff. Jason confidently declared that I was making the biggest mistake of my miserable life. He proudly announced that he would do exactly as I asked. He promised to submit the psychiatric evaluation to the judge, ensure the expert witness testified against my sanity, and absolutely destroy me in front of the entire court. He assured me that when the judge read the report detailing my severe violent trauma, I would be stripped of every single parental right I possessed. I kept my chilling smile perfectly intact. I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not try to convince him otherwise. I simply gathered my coat and my bag, maintaining my steady, impenetrable composure. Jamal stood up beside me, projecting a quiet, lethal confidence that perfectly mirrored my own. We turned our backs on the corporate army and walked out of the sterile conference room, leaving Jason and Brittany reveling in their perceived victory. As the heavy glass doors clicked shut behind us, closing out the sound of Jason's arrogant laughter, a profound sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. Jason believed he had just successfully cornered me. He believed he was going to walk into federal court and use that forged medical dossier to bury me alive. He was absolutely convinced he held all the power. He did not know that by officially deciding to submit those fabricated documents to a federal judge, he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. The trap was finally set, and Jason had eagerly locked himself inside it. 3 weeks later, the heavy oak doors of the federal family court closed behind us with a resounding thud. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was designed to be deliberately intimidating. High vaulted ceilings, dark wood paneling, and the imposing elevated bench where Judge Harrison sat, looking down at us with a stern, unreadable expression. The air felt sterile and cold, completely devoid of any warmth or humanity. This was a battlefield of protocol and procedure, and the stakes were nothing less than my son's entire future. I sat next to Jamal at the defense table. My posture was perfectly straight, projecting absolute discipline. I wore a tailored conservative charcoal suit, keeping my hands neatly folded in my lap to hide the slight ache in my right leg. Across the center aisle, Jason and Brittany sat flanking their lead attorney, Carver. Jason wore an impeccably tailored navy suit, looking every bit the concerned, affluent father he was pretending to be. Behind them, sitting in the first row of the public gallery, was my mother, Patricia. She wore a somber gray dress and gripped a lace tissue, already preparing her face for her upcoming theatrical debut. Judge Harrison struck his heavy wooden gavel, bringing the room to official order. He announced that we were here for the emergency custody petition filed by the plaintiff, Jason. Carver immediately stood up, confidently buttoning his expensive jacket, and called his very first witness to the stand. He called Jason. Jason walked to the witness box with practiced, deliberate hesitation. He acted exactly like a man carrying the agonizing weight of the world on his shoulders. He placed his right hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then sat down. Carver approached the wooden podium and began feeding him rehearsed, highly sympathetic questions. Jason executed his performance flawlessly. He spoke in a soft, trembling voice about how much he deeply loved our son Leo. He claimed that his sole motivation for dragging his ex-wife into federal court today was pure, desperate fatherly concern for his boy's immediate physical safety. Then Carver asked Jason to describe the end of our marriage. Jason actually managed to squeeze out a single calculated crocodile tear. He wiped it away with his knuckle and told the judge that he had tried everything humanly possible to save our family. He blatantly lied under oath, claiming that when I returned from my military deployment, I was completely unrecognizable. He told the court that he did not abandon me in a hospital bed, but rather he was forced to flee our home in the middle of the night because my behavior had become erratic, terrifying, and physically threatening. He painted himself as a terrified victim who had to protect his own life conveniently, leaving out the entirely documented fact that he had drained our joint accounts and moved into a luxury penthouse with his young assistant. I did not react. I felt Jamal shifting slightly beside me, diligently taking rapid notes on his yellow legal pad. Jamal was meticulously documenting every single perjured statement falling from Jason's mouth. The more Jason spoke, the deeper he dug his own criminal grave. Jason continued his fabricated narrative, stating that he had tried to remain in Leo's life over the past 4 years, but I had violently alienated him. He claimed he lay awake every single night, paralyzed with intense fear that my severe military trauma would cause me to snap and inadvertently harm our innocent child. After Jason finally stepped down from the box, dramatically dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief, handed to him by a very supportive-looking Brittany Carver, moved on to the next phase of their ambush. He called his star witness. He called my biological mother, Patricia, to the stand. Patricia walked slowly up the center aisle, acting exactly like a frail, heartbroken grandmother, tragically torn between loyalty to her daughter and her grandson's safety. She took the oath, her voice shaking with manufactured emotion, and sat in the witness box. Carver approached her with an exaggerated display of gentleness, asking her to describe her relationship with me since my return from military service. Patricia looked directly up at the judge and began to weep. Real flowing tears of absolute deception streamed down her cheeks. She sobbed that it absolutely broke her heart to testify against her own flesh and blood, but she simply had to put the safety of her helpless grandson first. She committed blatant, undeniable perjury right there in open federal court. She told Judge Harrison that I was completely broken and hopelessly unstable since returning from my deployment. She dramatically clutched her tissue, claiming that the brutal realities of war had permanently destroyed my mind. Patricia did not just offer vague insults or general concerns. She invented highly specific, terrifying scenarios to expertly build Carver's fraudulent case. She falsely testified that she had visited my home recently and found me screaming at the blank walls in the middle of the day. She claimed she had personally witnessed me throw heavy glass plates across the kitchen while little Leo cowered terrified in a corner. She swore under penalty of perjury that she had seen me experience violent night terrors where I could not distinguish domestic reality from a hostile combat zone. None of it ever happened. I had not even allowed Patricia inside my house for the past 3 years, until the very day she ambushed me alongside Jason. Carver then asked Patricia if she believed I was capable of providing a safe, nurturing environment for a growing child. Patricia shook her head vehemently, letting out a loud, tragic sob that echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. She told the judge that I was a severe, unpredictable danger to myself and everyone around me. She begged the court to grant full immediate custody to Jason and Brittany, describing their sprawling mansion as a necessary sanctuary of wealth, stability, and peace. She stated clearly and emphatically that if Leo remained in my care for even 1 more week, she genuinely feared she would soon be attending her only grandson's funeral. The entire courtroom was thick with a heavy, oppressive silence. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, permanently immortalizing every single malicious lie into the official legal record. Judge Harrison leaned far back in his tall leather chair, his face a mask of grave, deep concern. He looked down at me from the elevated bench, clearly absorbing the devastating, horrifying picture my own biological mother had just painted. Jason and Brittany sat together at their plaintiff table, looking completely triumphant, absolutely certain they had just won the war. They had successfully assassinated my character using the 2 people who were supposed to be closest to me. They were eagerly waiting for the final nail in the legal coffin, entirely unaware that Jamal was sitting right beside me, quietly holding the match that would burn their entire criminal operation straight to the ground. Carver buttoned his suit jacket, his chest puffed out with the arrogant certainty of a predator moving in for the final kill. He stepped away from the plaintiff table and walked purposefully toward the center of the courtroom. In his right hand, he carried the thick white dossier with the bold red lettering. The fabricated medical file we had seen during the deposition was now making its official debut in a federal courtroom. Carver cleared his throat, ensuring the court reporter was ready to capture his every word. He looked up at Judge Harrison with an expression of manufactured deep concern. He formally requested permission to submit the independent psychiatric evaluation into the official court record. He loudly designated it as Plaintiff Exhibit A. The bailiff stepped forward, took the heavy binder from Carver's hands, and walked it up the wooden steps to the elevated bench. Judge Harrison accepted the document. He put on his reading glasses, his face unreadable as he opened the cover. The only sound in the cavernous courtroom was the crisp rustle of thick paper as the judge turned the pages. Carver did not wait for him to finish reading. He immediately launched into a highly aggressive, deeply manipulative closing argument designed to force the judge into immediate drastic action. Carver paced the floor in front of the bench, his voice echoing off the dark wood paneling. He boldly proclaimed that the document in the judge's hands was a comprehensive peer-reviewed evaluation conducted by one of the most respected private psychiatric specialists in the state. He lied with absolute fluency. He began reciting specific fabricated excerpts from the report completely from memory, ensuring every horrific detail was transcribed into the permanent legal record. He stated that the medical expert had officially diagnosed me with severe violent post-traumatic stress disorder. He claimed my combat injuries had caused a permanent degenerative physical disability. He turned and pointed a sharp finger directly at me, violating every standard of courtroom decorum. He loudly declared that I was completely incapable of running, lifting, or performing basic physical tasks required to keep a 5-year-old child safe from harm. But the physical limitations were only the beginning of his assault. Carver raised his voice, injecting a tone of desperate urgency into his argument. He told the judge that the psychiatric evaluation proved I was prone to sudden explosive fits of violent rage. He referenced the perjured testimony my mother had just given, falsely linking her lies directly to the fabricated medical conclusions. Carver then executed the most dangerous part of Jason's master plan. He stopped pacing and stood perfectly still, looking up at Judge Harrison with wide, pleading eyes. He stated that this was no longer a standard custody dispute. He claimed it was a matter of imminent life-threatening danger to a helpless minor. He formally demanded that the court issue an immediate emergency protective order. He requested that Judge Harrison sign a mandate dispatching federal marshals or local law enforcement to my residence today, right this very second, to physically remove Leo from my care. He argued aggressively that leaving my son with me for even one more hour constituted a severe dereliction of judicial duty. He literally called me a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. I sat rigidly at the defense table, my hands folded perfectly in my lap. I could feel the intense, suffocating pressure of the entire courtroom bearing down on my shoulders. Jason sat across the aisle, his posture relaxed and victorious. He was watching me intently, waiting for the exact moment my spirit broke. He wanted to see me panic. He wanted me to leap out of my chair and scream that the document was a fake, which would only prove Carver's point about my explosive anger. Brittany sat beside him, biting her lip in a pathetic display of fake maternal worry, though her eyes gleamed with pure, unfiltered malice. In the gallery behind them, Patricia dabbed her dry eyes with her lace tissue, playing the role of the tragic, heartbroken grandmother who had bravely spoken the truth to save her family. Judge Harrison finished skimming the executive summary of the forged dossier. He closed the heavy binder and took off his reading glasses. The silence that followed was agonizingly heavy. The judge looked down at me from his elevated bench, and his face was a mask of grave, severe judgment. The deep lines around his mouth tightened into a harsh frown. He looked at me not as a decorated military veteran, but as a dangerous liability. Judge Harrison spoke, his voice rumbling through the quiet room. He stated clearly that these were some of the most disturbing, alarming medical assessments he had ever seen presented in his courtroom. He noted that the combination of severe physical mobility issues and highly explosive psychological instability, detailed in Exhibit A, painted a horrifying picture. He explicitly stated that a federal courtroom's primary duty was to ensure the absolute safety of the child, and that the evidence presented by the plaintiff was incredibly compelling. The audience in the courtroom, including the bailiffs and the court clerks, stared at me with undisguised apprehension. The atmosphere was pushed to the absolute edge of tension. It felt as though the oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the room. The trap had closed flawlessly. Jason had successfully weaponized the justice system, using his wealth to buy a fraudulent medical diagnosis that perfectly aligned with his malicious narrative. He had cornered me in front of a federal judge who was now visibly preparing to strip me of my motherhood. Jason allowed a tiny, imperceptible smirk to touch the corners of his mouth. Brittany reached over and squeezed his hand, her shoulders dropping in relief as she silently celebrated their total victory. They thought it was over. They thought they had successfully executed a flawless legal assassination. Judge Harrison turned his severe gaze away from me and looked directly at Jamal. He asked my attorney if the defense had any immediate verifiable objection to the admission of Plaintiff Exhibit A. He warned Jamal that unless the defense could provide a truly extraordinary reason, he was fully prepared to sign the emergency removal order and dispatch law enforcement to secure my son before the court recessed for lunch. The clock was ticking. The executioner's axe was suspended squarely over my neck. I did not flinch. I did not breathe heavily. I simply turned my head slightly and gave Jamal a single, nearly imperceptible nod. It was time to burn their house to the ground. Jamal received my subtle nod and immediately pushed his chair back. His massive frame commanded instant attention as he stood up in the silent courtroom. He buttoned his suit jacket with slow, deliberate precision, radiating the terrifying calm of a military prosecutor stepping onto a familiar battlefield. Carver watched him with a condescending smirk, heavily leaning back in his leather chair. The corporate lawyer fully expected a desperate, fumbling attempt at cross-examination. He thought Jamal was about to launch into a defensive, emotional plea to discredit my mother. Patricia gripped the wooden edge of the witness box, physically bracing herself for a barrage of angry questions. She had meticulously rehearsed her tears, perfectly prepared to play the heartbroken, victimized mother defending herself against an aggressive attorney. She tilted her chin up, ready for the spotlight. But Jamal did not even look at her. He turned his back on the witness box entirely. He addressed Judge Harrison directly, stating in a booming, authoritative voice that the defense had absolutely no questions for this particular witness. He firmly declared that cross-examining a blatant perjurer was a complete and utter waste of the court's valuable time. Patricia gasped loudly. Her theatrical sorrow instantly morphed into genuine, insulted outrage. Her mouth fell open in shock as she looked toward Jason for support. Carver jumped to his feet, slamming his hand on the table to object to the harsh characterization of his star witness, but Jamal completely ignored him. Without breaking eye contact with the judge, Jamal coldly instructed Patricia to step down from the stand and return to the public gallery. He treated my toxic mother with the exact same dismissive contempt one reserves for a minor, irrelevant nuisance. The psychological deflation was instantaneous. Patricia stumbled down the wooden steps, her grand performance abruptly canceled, her face flushed red with deep humiliation. Instead of returning to his seat at the defense table, Jamal reached down into his leather litigation briefcase. He did not pull out a standard legal folder or a printed stack of emails. He pulled out a heavy tamper-evident courier bag. It was a thick, reinforced poly mailer bordered with bright red and blue security tape. Across the front, highly visible black lettering warned that unauthorized access or tampering constituted a severe federal offense. Jamal walked confidently up the center aisle toward the elevated bench. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his shoes against the hardwood floor sounded like a ticking clock, counting down to Jason's destruction. Carver leaned forward, his arrogance faltering slightly as his eyes locked onto the bizarre, highly secure package. The smug smile completely vanished from Jason's face. He sat up entirely straight, his posture suddenly rigid with unease. Brittany craned her neck over the table, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging nervously into Jason's forearm as she sensed the dramatic shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Jamal stopped right in front of the judge's bench. He held the secure package out with both hands, presenting it with the utmost reverence. He formally announced to the court, that the defense wished to submit a piece of authenticated, newly declassified evidence that would completely and permanently invalidate Plaintiff Exhibit A. He stated with absolute conviction that this new evidence bypassed all standard medical discovery protocols because it was a matter of highest federal clearance. Carver leaped to his feet, his chair screeching loudly against the floor. He shouted a furious objection, screaming that the defense was attempting a blatant trial by ambush. He angrily demanded to know why this document had not been provided to his legal team during the mandatory civil discovery phase. He accused Jamal of hiding evidence and demanded the package be thrown out immediately. Jamal turned his head slowly to look at Carver with a cold, triumphant glare. He informed the opposing counsel that until exactly 8 o'clock this morning, the contents of this package were classified at the top secret level by the United States government. He stated flawlessly that providing this dossier to a civilian corporate lawyer during standard civil discovery would have constituted an act of treason. A collective audible gasp rippled through the entire courtroom. The bailiffs shifted their weight, suddenly highly alert. Even Judge Harrison sat up entirely straight, his previous judicial irritation instantly replaced by profound, serious attention. The air in the room grew electrically charged. Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He realized in real time that his expensive fabricated medical trap was crashing headfirst into the full weight of the federal government. Jamal turned his focus back to the bench. He officially presented the document as Defense Exhibit 1. He explained clearly that inside the tamper-proof bag was a direct, heavily authenticated personnel dossier compiled jointly by the United States Department of Defense and the Office of the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Judge Harrison reached down and accepted the heavy package from Jamal's hands. The courtroom remained deathly quiet as the judge meticulously examined the unbroken security seals and the holographic authentication stamps gleaming brightly under the fluorescent lights. Recognizing the immense gravity of the federal seals, the judge pulled a specialized letter opener from his desk and carefully sliced through the reinforced plastic tape. He withdrew a thick, incredibly detailed dossier bound by a heavy metal clasp. The cover page bore the official embossed insignias of both the Pentagon and the FBI. Jamal took a respectful step back, giving the judge ample room to process the monumental weight of the paperwork. The sound of turning pages echoed loudly. Judge Harrison's eyes widened fractionally as he scanned the preliminary security clearances and verified the direct signatures from top federal directors. Jamal stood tall, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. He respectfully requested that the court review the authentication signatures on page 2 to satisfy any lingering doubts from the plaintiff's table. Then, with a commanding tone that demanded total silence from every single person in the room, Jamal asked the judge to turn to page 4. He formally requested that Judge Harrison read the specific highlighted clearance and fitness summary aloud for the permanent official record so that Jason and his lawyers could hear exactly who they had tried to destroy. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the highlighted paragraph on page 4 of the dossier. The absolute silence in the courtroom amplified the crisp rustle of the heavy authenticated paper. He cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying an undeniable weight of supreme judicial authority as he read the official federal assessment aloud. Subject is identified as First Sergeant Lauren. The judge read, his tone reflecting a growing sense of profound astonishment. Following extensive physical rehabilitation, the subject has been evaluated by Department of Defense medical personnel and is officially declared 100% physically recovered from all combat-related injuries and subsequent surgeries. Subject recently passed Tier 1 Department of Defense physical fitness examinations with exceptional marks. Furthermore, subject is currently maintaining active top-secret security clearance. Judge Harrison paused for a long, heavy moment, looking directly at Jason and his legal team before returning his eyes to the page. Current operational assignment: Senior Cybersecurity Investigator, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Task Force. Carver dropped his expensive fountain pen. It clattered loudly against the mahogany table, rolling off the edge and bouncing onto the floor. He did not bother to pick it up. Jason sat completely frozen, his mouth hanging slightly open, all the color draining from his face until he looked like a chalk statue. Brittany darted her wide, terrified eyes back and forth between Jason and the judge, completely unable to comprehend the monumental shift that had just occurred. In the gallery, Patricia clutched the wooden bench in front of her knuckles turning stark white as the devastating truth shattered her entire fabricated reality, leaving her speechless. Jamal stepped into the center aisle, his voice echoing with absolute uncompromising command. He stated that the plaintiff had spent the entire morning painting a picture of a broken, unstable, unemployed veteran. Jamal declared that narrative was not just perjury, but a desperate, calculated distraction. He informed the court that I had spent the last 4 years in absolute silence, not because I was hiding in fear or crippled by trauma, but because I was executing a deep undercover cyber intelligence operation for the federal government. Jamal turned his piercing gaze directly onto Jason. He asked the courtroom a very simple, glaring question. Why would an absentee father, a wealthy executive who aggressively abandoned his infant son and ignored his existence for 4 entire years, suddenly demand emergency full custody? Jamal answered his own question with surgical precision. He stated that Jason was not motivated by sudden paternal love. He was motivated by sheer, unadulterated terror. Jamal pulled a secondary folder from his briefcase, one containing unclassified financial summaries authorized directly by the FBI director. He confidently laid the documents on the judge's bench. Jamal announced that Jason's carefully cultivated image as a wealthy, successful corporate executive was a complete and utter mirage. He revealed that Jason's pristine investment firm was actually nothing more than a massive, highly illegal front for cartel money laundering operations. My cyber intelligence unit had spent the last 18 months meticulously tracking Jason's offshore wire transfers. We had successfully traced every single stolen dollar, navigating a complex labyrinth of shell companies to uncover a massive web of international financial crimes. Jamal informed the judge that the FBI had already frozen Jason's illicit accounts earlier this week. Jason was not a multi-million-dollar success story. He was completely and entirely bankrupt. Worse than being broke, Jason owed millions of dollars to incredibly dangerous, violent international criminals who were actively hunting him down to collect their debts. Brittany gasped, her hands flying to her throat as the illusion of her luxurious lifestyle vaporized instantly. The sprawling mansion, the custom-built bedroom, the endless shopping sprees, all of it was funded by stolen, laundered cartel money. The lavish life she constantly bragged about online was built entirely on a foundation of severe federal crimes. Carver stood up, his face pale and sweating profusely, trying to formulate a cohesive objection, but he had absolutely no legal ground to stand on against a federal investigation. Jamal ignored the flustered corporate lawyer entirely, delivering the final crushing blow. He turned back to the judge and explained the true horrifying reason behind this brutal custody lawsuit. Jamal stated that when I was severely injured in combat, the military and several allied veteran organizations established a specialized untouchable trust fund specifically for Leo's future care and education. That military trust fund was currently valued at exactly $2 million. Since I was the sole guardian, the money remained perfectly secure and inaccessible to anyone else under any circumstances. Jamal pointed a steady, condemning finger straight at Jason. He told the court that Jason did not want a son. Jason wanted a hostage. Jason desperately needed legal conservatorship over Leo to gain direct administrative control of that $2 million trust fund. His entire custody petition was a malicious, calculated plot to steal his own 5-year-old son's money just to pay off his criminal debts and save his own miserable skin from certain retaliation. He was willing to destroy my reputation, forge medical documents, and rip a child away from his mother solely to save himself. The magnitude of the revelation hit the courtroom like a seismic shockwave. The judge stared at Jason with absolute disgust, recognizing the sheer depravity of a man willing to sacrifice his child for financial salvation. The bailiffs immediately moved closer to the plaintiff's table, recognizing that Jason was no longer just a party in a family court dispute. He was a high-flight risk federal suspect, facing decades behind bars. The trap I had laid in the courtyard had finally snapped shut with bone-crushing force. Jason thought he could use my combat service to destroy me, completely unaware that my service had given me the exact tools needed to dismantle his entire criminal empire from the inside out, piece by bloody piece, leaving him with absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The crushing weight of Jamal's revelation hung in the cavernous courtroom like a physical entity. Judge Harrison slowly lowered the classified federal dossier onto his elevated bench, aligning it perfectly parallel to the fabricated medical file Carver had submitted just moments earlier. The contrast between the two documents was the visual representation of Jason's impending doom. On the left sat an authenticated top-secret assessment from the United States government, proving my absolute fitness and active service. On the right sat Plaintiff Exhibit a flimsy bought and paid-for piece of criminal fiction designed to steal a child for financial gain. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents, a sharp contrast to the deafening silence that had paralyzed every single person present. Jason sat frozen at the plaintiff table. His perfectly tailored navy suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, hanging loosely off his rigid shoulders. The arrogant, triumphant glow that had radiated from him since the school courtyard ambush was entirely extinguished. In its place was a sickening, chalky pallor. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a trapdoor, hearing the wooden lever snap open beneath his expensive leather shoes. Judge Harrison leaned forward, pressing his hands flat against the dark wood of his bench. His gaze locked onto Jason with an intensity that could melt steel. The judge did not yell. He did not need to raise his voice to convey the absolute, terrifying wrath of the federal justice system. He spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that sent a visible shudder down Jason's spine. The judge systematically outlined the catastrophic legal reality of what had just occurred. He stated clearly that submitting fabricated evidence into the official record of a federal court was not a simple misstep or a minor procedural error. It was a severe, premeditated felony. He listed the exact charges Jason and his legal team were now actively facing, emphasizing the phrases aggravated perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and the malicious submission of forged medical documents to influence a federal ruling. He detailed the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines associated with these crimes, making sure Jason understood that he was no longer looking at a custody dispute, but rather a guaranteed lengthy stay in a federal penitentiary. Jason's hands began to tremble violently. He stared at the judge, his mouth opening and closing in rapid succession, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The reality of his bankruptcy, his cartel debts, and now his impending incarceration collided in his mind, shattering his carefully constructed facade into a million jagged pieces. The wealthy, untouchable corporate executive was gone, replaced entirely by a cornered, terrified criminal, realizing there was absolutely no escape. The panic finally broke through his physical paralysis. Jason abruptly shot up from his leather chair, the sudden movement causing the heavy piece of furniture to tip backward and slam forcefully against the wooden railing separating the gallery. The loud crash made Brittany flinch violently beside him. Jason raised his shaking hands in the air, a frantic, desperate gesture of surrender. He looked at Judge Harrison with wide, pleading eyes, completely abandoning the composed, sympathetic father persona he had performed so flawlessly just minutes prior. He began to stammer, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a pathetic, disjointed rush. He swore to the court that he had absolutely no idea the psychiatric evaluation was a forgery. He frantically claimed that he was not a medical expert and had simply trusted the professionals he hired to gather accurate information regarding his son's safety. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Carver, wildly attempting to shift the entirety of the blame onto his own lead counsel. Jason loudly accused his legal team of orchestrating the fabrication, insisting that Carver had handled all the evidence gathering and had assured him the document was perfectly legitimate. He begged the judge to understand that he was just a concerned parent who had been misled by aggressive, overzealous lawyers. The betrayal at the plaintiff table was instantaneous and absolute. Carver was a ruthless corporate shark who billed thousands of dollars an hour, but he was not a fool, and he certainly was not going to risk his law license, his freedom, or his pristine reputation to take the fall for a bankrupt client facing federal money laundering charges. Carver leaped to his feet, his face flushed dark red with a mixture of profound insult and self-preservation. He violently rejected Jason's frantic accusations, his voice booming across the courtroom as he defended his own innocence. Carver turned his back on Jason and addressed the judge directly, his tone sharp and urgent. He stated for the permanent official record that his law firm had absolutely zero involvement in sourcing, interviewing, or commissioning the psychiatric evaluation submitted as Exhibit A. Carver threw Jason straight under the proverbial bus without a single ounce of hesitation. He loudly declared that his client had personally provided the sealed medical dossier to the legal team just 3 days prior to the deposition. He testified right there in open court that Jason had explicitly assured the firm the document was a verified, independent assessment obtained through legitimate medical channels. Carver made it perfectly clear that he had acted in good faith based entirely on his client's fraudulent assurances. The implosion was magnificent to witness. Jason stared at Carver, his eyes wide with sheer terror, as his primary line of defense transformed into a hostile witness right before his eyes. He realized that Carver was actively laying the groundwork to testify against him in a criminal trial. Jason looked back at the judge, shaking his head frantically, completely unable to form a coherent sentence, as the walls of the courtroom closed in around him. He was drowning in his own lies, completely stripped of his wealth, his legal protection, and his arrogant pride. The absolute, unadulterated terror radiating from him proved that my silence had indeed been the deadliest weapon of all. The absolute, unadulterated terror radiating from him proved that my silence had indeed been the deadliest weapon of all. Brittany sat rigidly beside her crumbling husband, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. The pristine, wealthy reality she had built her entire identity around was evaporating into thin air right in front of her. For the past hour, she had been comfortably playing the role of the affluent, rescuing stepmother, absolutely certain that her husband possessed the financial power to crush me into dust. Now the deafening echoes of Jamal's revelations were finally penetrating her carefully constructed delusions of grandeur. Jason was not a multi-million-dollar financial genius. He was a bankrupt fraud. The custom-built mansion, the imported luxury cars, the endless shopping sprees and high-end boutiques, all of it was financed by violent cartels. She processed the terrifying reality that the money was completely gone. Worse, the federal government and dangerous international syndicates were both actively hunting the man sitting right next to her. The luxurious future she had envisioned, the one she had constantly bragged about to her massive social media following, was actually a fast-track ticket to a federal penitentiary. The sheer weight of her impending ruin finally snapped her fragile composure. Brittany violently shoved her heavy leather chair backward. The legs screeched agonizingly against the hardwood floor as she leaped to her feet. She physically recoiled from Jason as if he were suddenly covered in something toxic. Her face, previously arranged in a mask of malicious triumph, contorted into a mask of pure hysterical panic. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Jason's chest and began to scream at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning any remaining shred of courtroom decorum. She shrieked that she had absolutely no idea about any of this. She hysterically declared to the judge, the bailiffs, and anyone else who would listen that she was nothing more than an innocent victim in Jason's elaborate, sick charade. Her voice reached a shrill, piercing pitch as she sobbed loudly, claiming Jason had lied to her since the very day they met. She wailed that he had promised her a life of unimaginable wealth and absolute security. She forcefully threw her husband under the bus, eager to sacrifice him to save her own skin. She shouted that he was a manipulative, abusive monster who had tricked a young, naive woman into marrying a broke, desperate criminal. Brittany spun around to face Judge Harrison, tears streaming down her face in thick black streaks of ruined makeup. She begged the court for mercy, desperately trying to distance herself from the man she had proudly stood beside just 10 minutes prior. She swore under oath that she had zero knowledge of his money laundering operations, his offshore accounts, or his terrifying debts to criminal syndicates. She pleaded her absolute innocence regarding the custody lawsuit, claiming Jason had forced her to participate in the ambush at the school courtyard. She portrayed herself as a helpless pawn, declaring that Jason had dictated every cruel word she had spoken into her phone camera that day. She insisted she only wanted what was best for Leo, crying that Jason had fed her endless lies about my mental instability to justify his aggressive legal strategy. She desperately sought to weaponize her tears, hoping the judge would view her as just another casualty of Jason's destructive path. She wanted to walk out of those heavy oak doors free and clear, leaving her ruined husband to face the devastating consequences alone. I watched her frantic, pathetic performance with absolute icy detachment. She was attempting to execute the exact same survival tactic Jason had just tried to use on his own lead attorney. They were wolves turning on each other the second they smelled their own blood in the water. Jamal stood quietly beside our defense table, observing her hysterical meltdown with the cold, analytical patience of a seasoned predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He allowed her to scream, to cry, and to build her towering monument of lies. He waited until she finally paused to gasp for a ragged breath. Then Jamal stepped forward, his deep, resonant voice easily cutting through the chaotic echoes of her sobbing. He politely requested the court's attention, addressing Judge Harrison with absolute unwavering respect. Jamal calmly stated that while the plaintiff's new wife was delivering a highly entertaining, deeply emotional performance, her claims of total innocence were entirely contradicted by the hard, undeniable financial evidence currently resting in his briefcase. Jamal reached into his leather bag and produced a slender, meticulously organized folder. He walked the document directly up to the elevated bench, submitting it for the judge's immediate review. Jamal turned to face Brittany, his gaze stripping away every single layer of her pathetic victim routine. He announced to the silent courtroom that the folder contained certified, unredacted wire transfer receipts obtained legally through our federal investigation. He explained that purchasing a fabricated medical dossier from a corrupt private physician required a highly specific, very expensive, and deeply illegal financial transaction. Jason's own personal bank accounts had been frozen by federal authorities well before the custody deposition took place. Jason did not have the physical means to pay the corrupt doctor for the forged severe psychiatric diagnosis. Jamal pointed a firm, accusing finger squarely at Brittany. He loudly declared that the official routing numbers and the digital signature on the $50,000 wire transfer used to purchase the fraudulent medical evaluation belonged entirely to her. Jamal broke down the undeniable paper trail with surgical precision. He stated that Brittany had willingly opened a secondary hidden bank account specifically to move Jason's illicit funds away from the prying eyes of federal auditors. She had personally authorized the massive payment to the disgraced psychiatrist. Her digital signature was stamped on every single illegal transaction required to generate Plaintiff Exhibit A. She was not an innocent, naive bystander, dragged unknowingly into a complex legal battle. She was an active, willing, and financially liable co-conspirator who had paid cold, hard cash to buy a fake medical diagnosis designed to steal a child from his mother. Jamal locked eyes with the terrified woman standing across the aisle. He informed her that committing wire fraud and actively funding the creation of perjured court documents were severe federal felonies. Her legs suddenly gave out beneath her. Brittany collapsed heavily back into her leather chair, the remaining color completely draining from her tear-stained face. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She was not walking away from this disaster. By trying to destroy my life, she had successfully purchased her own one-way ticket to a federal prison. While Brittany hyperventilated in her chair and Jason sat immobilized by total defeat, a secondary shockwave rippled through the courtroom gallery. Sitting in the very first row of the polished wooden pews was my biological mother. Patricia had spent the entire morning basking in the glow of her own theatrical performance. She had comfortably lied under oath, shedding calculated tears while branding me a violent, unstable danger to my own son. She had enthusiastically aligned herself with Jason, absolutely convinced that his massive wealth and corporate status would elevate her own social standing. Now watching the federal judge review undeniable proof of Jason's cartel money laundering and Brittany's wire fraud, the horrifying reality of her own actions slammed into her chest. Patricia slowly lowered her lace tissue. Her meticulously applied makeup could not hide the sudden sickly gray hue spreading across her face. She looked at Jason, the man she had proudly championed as the perfect father, and finally saw a bankrupt, desperate felon who was about to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He had absolutely zero money to pay for his own legal defense, let alone bankroll an expensive defense attorney to save her. Then the true catastrophic weight of her morning testimony crashed down upon her. She had placed her right hand on a Bible in a federal courtroom and deliberately committed aggravated perjury. She had actively conspired to submit a fraudulent medical dossier to a federal judge. Patricia realized with bone-chilling clarity that she was no longer just an arrogant grandmother meddling in a custody dispute. She was an unindicted co-conspirator in a federal fraud case. Panic, raw and unfiltered, violently hijacked her nervous system. All her carefully cultivated socialite grace instantly evaporated. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her expensive handbag tumbling off her lap and spilling its contents across the gallery floor. She did not bother to pick it up. She ignored the strict rules of courtroom decorum and pushed past the heavy wooden swinging doors that separated the public viewing area from the active trial tables. The sharp, frantic clicking of her designer heels echoed loudly against the hardwood floor as she rushed directly toward the defense table where Jamal and I were seated. A court bailiff immediately stepped forward to intercept her, resting his hand firmly on his utility belt. He ordered her to return to the gallery, but Patricia was completely blinded by sheer, unadulterated terror. She dodged the officer, practically sprinting the last few yards, until she reached the edge of our table. She collided heavily with the solid mahogany edge, grasping the wood with trembling hands to keep herself from collapsing. The poised, condescending woman who had sneered at my military combat boots just a few weeks ago was entirely gone. In her place stood a pathetic, groveling shell of a human being completely consumed by the terrifying prospect of wearing a prison uniform. Patricia looked down at me, her eyes wide and wild. Real, frantic tears streamed down her cheeks, entirely different from the fake manufactured sobbing she had used on the witness stand. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she desperately scrambled to execute a complete reversal of her loyalties. She reached her hands out across the table, her fingers violently shaking as she tried to bridge the physical and emotional distance between us. She cried out my name, her voice cracking with desperate, high-pitched hysteria. She loudly declared that she had been completely blinded by Jason's lies. She swore to me and to the entire courtroom that she had absolutely no idea the psychiatric evaluation was a forged document. She frantically attempted to rewrite history right in front of my eyes, claiming Jason had manipulated her maternal concerns and tricked her into testifying against me. She begged me to believe that she was just an innocent, worried grandmother who had been cruelly deceived by a master manipulator. I remained perfectly seated. I did not lean away from her grasping hands, nor did I lean toward them. I simply watched her unravel. My face remained a mask of absolute, impenetrable calm. Jamal stood tall beside me, his muscular frame acting as an immovable barrier, but he did not intervene. He knew I did not need his protection to handle a coward. Patricia realized her excuses were bouncing harmlessly off my icy exterior. She desperately changed her tactics, resorting to the oldest, most toxic weapon in her entire arsenal. She tried to play the blood card. She leaned further across the table, her voice dropping into a frantic, pleading whine. She reminded me that she was the woman who had given birth to me. She wept openly, demanding that I remember the unconditional bond between a mother and her daughter. She shamelessly declared that deep down she had always loved me more than anything else in the entire world. She begged me to search my heart and find the mercy she had aggressively denied me my entire life. She reached out desperately, attempting to grab my forearms, hoping a physical hug would somehow erase the fact that she had just tried to strip my child away from me. She pleaded with me to tell Jamal to drop the perjury charges. She sobbed that she was far too old to survive in a federal prison. She frantically whispered that family must always protect family completely, ignoring the fact that she had just spent the last 4 years actively trying to destroy mine. She demanded that I use my federal clearance and my influence to shield her from the judge's wrath, insisting that a daughter could never allow her own mother to be locked away in a concrete cell. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her begging was almost hypnotic. She had confidently walked into this courtroom, ready to scientifically brand me a violent monster. She had eagerly participated in a calculated plot to hand my 5-year-old son over to a money-laundering criminal. Now facing the exact same destruction she had enthusiastically planned for me, she expected me to instantly transform back into a compliant, obedient daughter and shield her from the consequences of her own malicious greed. The level of entitlement was staggering, and it cemented the final necessary realization in my mind. She was not a mother making a mistake. She was a parasite looking for a new host. The bailiff finally closed the distance, grabbing Patricia firmly by the upper arm and instructing her to step back from the defense table immediately. She resisted his grip, digging her heels into the floor, keeping her pleading, tear-filled eyes locked onto my face. She wailed my name one last time, begging for a single shred of validation, waiting for me to break my silence and offer her the maternal salvation she absolutely did not deserve. I watched the bailiff tighten his grip on Patricia's arm, his stern command for her to step back, echoing in the tense, electrified air of the courtroom. She fought his hold, her tear-streaked face stretched in an agonizing mask of desperation as she waited for my absolution. I slowly pushed my heavy leather chair back and stood up. I did not reach out to comfort her. I took a deliberate, measured step backward, putting an undeniable physical boundary between us. The desperate, manipulative hope in her eyes flickered and died as she realized no lifeline was coming from me. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical emptiness. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single syllable sliced through her remaining delusions with absolute surgical precision. I told her that a real mother would have rushed to her daughter's hospital bed 4 years ago instead of blindly aligning with the man who put her there. I reminded her that she had confidently walked into this federal building today, fully prepared to medically brand me a monster and rip my child away entirely for the hollow promise of country club invitations and a heated pool. She gasped, shaking her head in frantic denial, but I did not stop. I delivered the final, undeniable truth of our relationship. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and said, "You were never my mother. You just worshipped the highest bidder." The absolute finality of my words struck her like a physical blow to the chest. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she slumped heavily against the wooden railing of the gallery, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The bailiff released his grip, recognizing she was no longer a flight risk, but rather a completely broken woman paralyzed by her own overwhelming greed. Jamal stood tall beside me, his silent presence an immovable wall of support. He gave me a brief, approving nod. I turned my back on Patricia, entirely dismissing her existence, and directed my attention back to the elevated bench. Judge Harrison was watching the dramatic scene unfold, with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a violent, thunderous crack that instantly silenced Patricia's pathetic weeping and snapped the entire courtroom back to order. The judge leaned forward, his voice vibrating with absolute judicial fury. He directed his blistering anger squarely at Jason and his panicked legal team. He loudly proclaimed that the plaintiff's emergency custody petition was the most malicious, deeply corrupt abuse of the family court system he had ever witnessed in his entire career on the bench. He formally addressed the forged medical dossier, stating that attempting to weaponize a combat veteran's honorable service with fabricated psychiatric records was an absolute stain on the legal profession. Carver, the lead attorney, kept his head bowed, frantically packing his expensive briefcase as he realized his lucrative career was essentially over. Judge Harrison announced his official ruling with absolute uncompromising authority. He threw out the custody petition, entirely dismissing it with extreme prejudice. He declared that Jason would never be granted another custody hearing in his jurisdiction. Furthermore, the judge announced he was immediately referring Carver, Jason, Brittany, and Patricia to the United States Attorney's Office for criminal investigation regarding perjury, fraud, and conspiracy. Jason squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. He knew the custody battle was lost, but he had absolutely no idea the real nightmare was just beginning. Before Judge Harrison could formally adjourn the session, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a forceful, synchronized motion. 6 federal agents marched down the center aisle. They moved with swift, tactical precision, wearing dark suits and clearly visible FBI badges clipped to their belts. My cyber intelligence unit had timed this perfectly. They had waited for Jason to commit federal perjury on the official record before executing the arrest warrants. The lead agent bypassed the gallery entirely and marched straight toward the plaintiff's table. Jason opened his eyes, staring in absolute suffocating terror as the federal agents rapidly surrounded him and his new wife. The lead agent stated Jason's full name, officially placing him under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and conspiracy to commit forgery. Jason did not fight back. He slowly raised his trembling hands, his expensive, tailored suit wrinkling, as the agent roughly pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp, satisfying metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around Jason's wrists echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. It was the sound of absolute justice, the undeniable culmination of 4 years of patient, meticulous tracking. Right beside him, Brittany shrieked as a female agent firmly grabbed her wrists. She kicked and thrashed, screaming that her designer dress was being ruined and begging anyone to help her. The agent ignored her tantrum, swiftly locking the cold steel cuffs around Brittany's wrists and loudly reading her Miranda rights. The courtroom transformed into a chaotic flurry of federal action, but I remained perfectly still, watching the scene unfold with immense satisfaction. Jason was roughly hoisted to his feet by 2 strong agents. His face was completely devoid of its former arrogance, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man who realized his life was entirely over. He cast one final desperate look in my direction, silently pleading for the mercy he had never shown me. I did not flinch, nor did I offer a single ounce of pity. I simply watched as the agents marched the disgraced, bankrupt executive down the center aisle and out the heavy oak doors. Brittany followed closely behind, sobbing hysterically as she was dragged away to face her own extensive federal charges. Her cries echoed down the courthouse hallway until they finally faded into complete silence. The immediate threat to my son was entirely neutralized, and the criminals who had attempted to steal my life were effectively removed from society. The courtroom was finally silent. I stood at the defense table and took a deep, cleansing breath. The stale, oppressive air of the legal battlefield had completely dissipated, replaced by the profound clarity of absolute victory. Jamal clapped a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder, his dark eyes reflecting a deep, mutual respect. We methodically gathered our files, snapping the leather briefcases shut. I deliberately left the forged medical dossier and the glossy photographs of Brittany's blood money mansion sitting abandoned on the plaintiff's table. Those items were federal evidence now destined for a prosecutor's desk rather than my memory. As we turned to leave, I caught one final fleeting glimpse of Patricia in the gallery. She was still slumped heavily against the wooden railing, staring vacantly at the spot where Jason had been arrested. Her elite socialite world had burned to ash in a matter of minutes. I did not pause. I did not offer her a parting glance. I walked right past her without breaking my stride, erasing her from my reality forever. Jamal pushed open the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, and we stepped out into the expansive marble-lined hallway of the federal courthouse. With every single step I took away from that room, a meticulously constructed layer of my defensive facade melted away. For weeks, I had purposefully exaggerated the slight stiffness in my right knee. I had carefully maintained a subtle, calculated limp whenever I was in the presence of Jason Brittany or my toxic mother. I had fed their arrogant delusions, allowing them to believe their own cruel narrative that I was a broken, physically incapacitated victim. That performance ended right now. The moment the courtroom doors clicked shut behind me, my posture shifted. My spine straightened, realigning into the formidable athletic stance of an active-duty federal investigator. The fabricated limp vanished completely. My heels struck the polished stone floor in a rapid, perfectly even rhythm. I strode forward with absolute authority and undeniable power. The physical exertion of pretending to be weak had been incredibly taxing, and the relief of moving with my full, hard-won strength was exhilarating. Jamal walked beside me, a knowing, satisfied smile playing on his lips as he watched me drop the crippled veteran act. We marched down the long corridor, an impenetrable united front, leaving the wreckage of Jason's criminal empire far behind us. We reached the main exit and pushed through the massive glass doors of the courthouse building. The contrast was breathtaking. We stepped out of the cold, sterile shadows of the justice system and directly into the brilliant, blinding sunshine of a perfect afternoon. The warmth of the sun hit my face, a golden, radiant validation of everything we had just accomplished. The crisp, clean air filled my lungs entirely, washing away the lingering scent of Brittany's heavy perfume and the toxic stress of the past 4 years. Standing by the large stone fountain in the center of the courthouse plaza were Naomi and little Leo. My sister had taken him out for ice cream while Jamal and I handled the legal execution inside. Naomi looked up, her anxious eyes scanning my face for a verdict. The moment she saw the bright, unburdened smile radiating across my features, her shoulders dropped in massive relief. She let out a joyous, echoing laugh. Leo turned around, a smudge of chocolate ice cream on his cheek. His eyes lit up with pure, unfiltered joy. He shouted my name and broke into a dead sprint across the plaza courtyard. I did not hesitate. I did not brace myself for an impact or favor my right leg. I dropped my leather briefcase onto the concrete, bent my knees, and caught my 50-pound son mid-run. I lifted him effortlessly into the air, spinning him around in the bright sunshine. There was absolutely no pain, no hesitation, and no weakness. There was only the immense, overwhelming power of a mother holding her completely safe, fiercely protected child. I buried my face in his neck, inhaling the sweet scent of vanilla and childhood innocence, silently promising him that no one would ever threaten our peace again. Naomi rushed forward, wrapping her arms around both of us in a fierce, protective embrace. Jamal stepped up right behind her, wrapping his massive arms around his wife, his nephew, and his sister-in-law. We stood there in the sunlight, a solid, unbreakable fortress of genuine love and unwavering loyalty. This was my real family. These were the people who showed up, who fought the hard battles, and who never once doubted my strength. I set Leo down gently, keeping one hand resting protectively on his small shoulder. I looked out over the bustling city plaza, watching the crowds of people going about their daily lives, completely unaware of the massive federal takedown that had just occurred mere feet away. I thought about Jason sitting in a holding cell, stripped of his stolen wealth and his arrogant pride. I thought about Brittany realizing her vanity had bought her a prison sentence. I thought about Patricia alone and ruined by her own insatiable greed. They had all wildly underestimated their target. They thought breaking my legs meant I would never stand up again. They forgot a soldier never goes into a war zone unarmed, never mistake a woman's silence for weakness. Have you ever let your enemies dig their own graves with their arrogance? Tell me your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more. The story of Lauren serves as a powerful testament to the fact that true strength often lies in silence and strategic patience. In a society that frequently encourages loud, immediate reactions to injustice, Lauren's journey beautifully illustrates the profound advantage of keeping one's composure under extreme emotional and psychological fire. When confronted with the cruelest forms of betrayal, an ex-husband weaponizing her combat trauma, a new wife seeking internet clout, and a biological mother willing to commit perjury for social status, Lauren did not break. She did not scream cry or give her abusers the satisfying breakdown they so desperately craved. Instead, she utilized the discipline she acquired from her military service to assess the battlefield, gather her evidence, and let her adversaries dig their own graves through their unchecked arrogance. The lesson here is deeply resonant. You do not owe your abusers an emotional response, nor do you have to engage in their chaotic games. By maintaining her silence and leaning on her true chosen family, her brother-in-law Jamal and sister Naomi Lauren protected her inner peace while meticulously preparing a defense that ultimately dismantled her ex-husband's entire criminal facade. Furthermore, her story redefines what it means to be vulnerable. Scars, whether physical or emotional, are not liabilities. They are proof of survival and resilience. Her abusers attempted to use her combat injuries as proof of weakness, yet those very experiences equipped her with the tactical brilliance needed to secure her son's future. Ultimately, we learn that our worth is never defined by those who are blinded by greed and incapable of recognizing it. Stand firm in your own truth. Trust your resilience and take back your power today by refusing to let toxic people dictate your worth.